Section 1. The Yellow Skin Problem. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up if you have one. Dim the screen. Find whatever position your body has been asking for the last hour. Find whatever position your body has been asking for the last hour and settle into it, because we are going to be in Springfield for a long time tonight, and Springfield for all its faults, and we are going to discuss many of its faults in considerable depth, is actually a surprisingly good place to fall asleep. It has a familiar rhythm to it. The same streets, the same family, the same cracked cooling towers on the horizon. There is a comfort in the repetition, even when the repetition is what we're here to examine, and we are here to examine it, not unkindly, not dismissively, but honestly, which is a thing The Simpsons has always claimed to value and has not always managed to deliver. We are going to spend the next few hours walking through the things that have been wrong with this show since before most of its current audience was born, through 36 seasons and approximately 800 episodes of American animated television history. We are going to be thorough. We are going to be precise. We are going to follow each thread wherever it leads. And if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of it, that's fine. That's actually the point. The show will still be wrong when you wake up. Springfield will still be there. The family will still be on the couch. Let's start with the most obvious thing in the entire show. The thing that is so obvious that it has become invisible. The thing you stopped questioning so long ago that you may have forgotten you ever had a question in the first place, even though the question is sitting right there, in every single frame of every single episode, rendered in the distinctive color of school buses and legal pads, and a particular shade of mustard that belongs to no human population on Earth. Everyone in Springfield is yellow. Not one person. Not a few people. Not the Simpson family specifically as some kind of genetic peculiarity. Every resident of Springfield, from the school principal to the town drunk, to the woman who runs the retirement home, to the man who drives the tow truck, and the teacher, and the pharmacist, and the mayor, and the priest, they are all the same particular shade of yellow. A consistent, saturated, unmistakable yellow that does not appear in nature on a human face, that does not correspond to any pigmentation condition in medical literature, that does not exist outside the specific geographic and demographic boundaries of the town of Springfield. You know the official explanation. You have probably repeated it yourself. The yellow skin is a creative and commercial choice made by Matt Groening during the show's development in the late 1980s. The logic, as Groening has explained it in various interviews across the decades, was purely functional. When a viewer was flipping through channels, this was the era of channel surfing, of 30-something channels and a remote control, and the specific anxiety of television abundance, and they happened to land on The Simpsons for even a fraction of a second. The unusual skin color would register immediately and distinctively. You would know, in that half second of accidental viewing, exactly what you were looking at. It was a visual hook, a brand mark. A piece of design thinking that served the show's need to be immediately recognizable in a competitive television landscape. This is a reasonable explanation. It is probably also true, at least as an account of the original intent. And for the vast majority of viewers across the show's entire run, it has been sufficient. The yellow skin is an art style choice. It's just how the show looks. The question does not need to be extended further. Except the show itself, across hundreds of episodes and more than 3 decades of storytelling, has repeatedly created the conditions under which the official explanation becomes inadequate. Has repeatedly done things that, when you look at them carefully, suggest that the yellow skin is not simply an art style choice, but something the show's internal logic has been encoding with meaning all along, meaning the show has never fully articulated, but has never fully abandoned either. The problem begins, as so many of Springfield's problems do, with what happens when the outside world visits Springfield. When celebrity guest stars appear on The Simpsons, and we will discuss the celebrity guest star phenomenon at considerable length later in this video, because it has its own entire set of problems. They are drawn differently from the Springfield residents who surround them. Not dramatically differently, not in ways that break the visual coherence of the scene, but meaningfully differently. Their proportions are more naturalistic. The angles of their features sit closer to what an actual human face looks like. Their eyes, while still stylized in the show's vocabulary, are positioned and sized in ways that feel less extreme than the bulging, pushed-forward eyes that characterize Springfield's permanent population. The The skin tones of guest characters, while still rendered in the show's palette, tend toward less saturated yellows or occasionally toward entirely different tones. This distinction has been present since the show's early seasons. It is consistent. It has been maintained through multiple showrunners, multiple animation studios, multiple production eras. The show has always drawn a visual distinction between people from Springfield and people who come from somewhere else. The standard dismissal of this observation is that it reflects nothing more than the animator's natural tendency to draw celebrity likenesses with more attention to realistic detail, to honor the specific features of a famous face in a way that requires departing slightly from the show's default aesthetic. This is probably part of the explanation. When you are animating a character who is recognizably Tom Jones or Meryl Streep or Tony Hawk, you have to attend more carefully to the specific proportions of their actual face, and those proportions will naturally pull the character towards something more realistic. But this explanation does not fully account for the consistency of the distinction, or for the fact that it applies to non-celebrity guest characters as well, to characters who are canonically from outside Springfield, who arrive from other cities and other states, who are visiting rather than residing. These characters also tend to be drawn with slightly more realistic proportions than their Springfield counterparts, even when they are entirely fictional and have no real-world face to be faithful to. The visual grammar of the show draws a distinction between inside Springfield and outside Springfield. The people inside look one way. The people outside look another way. And within the show's own established logic about what is happening to Springfield, what has been happening to it for decades, slowly and invisibly, flowing from the cracked towers and the leaking pipes and the three-eyed fish in the river, this distinction is not arbitrary. Let's talk about the Springfield nuclear power plant, which we will spend a great deal of time with over the course of this video because it is, in the show's own terms, the source of most of what has gone wrong with Springfield. The plant was established in the show's earliest episodes as the primary economic institution of the town and as Homer Simpson's workplace, and it has been depicted across hundreds of episodes as one of the most dangerous and comprehensively mismanaged industrial facilities in the history of American fiction. The specific safety violations of the Springfield nuclear power plant have been documented in the show across dozens of episodes. A comprehensive safety inspection performed by agents who were genuinely surprised by what they found identified 342 distinct violations. That number is not a throwaway gag. That is the show establishing, with specific numerical precision, that the plant is operating in a state of catastrophic non-compliance with basic safety standards. 342 things that are wrong with a facility whose wrongness can contaminate a watershed, compromise an air supply, and irradiate a food chain. The cost estimate to bring the plant into compliance was provided in the episode that established the violation count. Approximately $56 million. Mr. Burns, who is a billionaire many times over, and for whom $56 million represents a fraction of his total wealth, declined to spend it, not because he couldn't. Because spending it would mean acknowledging that the violations existed, and acknowledging that the violations existed would mean someone might start asking what those violations had already done. What years of ignoring those 342 problems had leaked into the ground and the water and the air of the town built around the plant? The specific violations the show depicts are not minor. The show takes care to make them vivid and specific when it depicts them. Radioactive waste has been dumped into rivers and streams and bodies of water that flow through Springfield. Radioactive waste has been deposited on children's playgrounds, in proximity to the places where Springfield's children spend their days. Plutonium actual weapons-grade fissile material has been used as a desk ornament, sitting in open air, handled by employees without protective equipment. The cooling towers, which exist specifically to prevent the reactor's heat from becoming catastrophic, have been patched with chewing gum. Chewing gum. The emergency response to the structural failure of critical safety infrastructure was chewing gum. Inside the facility, luminous rats glowing in the dark, visibly affected by radiation exposure, run through the maintenance corridors. The show has depicted this directly and without treating it as anything other than a background detail. The rats glow. They live in the walls. The maintenance crews work around them, and there are skeletons in the basement, human skeletons. The show establishes this in passing, shows you the bones, and moves on without explanation or follow-up. Nobody in the episode asks whose bones they are. Nobody asks how they got there. Nobody reports them or investigates them or closes the plant pending an inquiry into how human remains ended up in the basement of a working nuclear reactor. The bones are simply there, one more detail in the show's accumulating picture of a facility that should not be allowed to operate, and Springfield looks at the bones and shrugs and goes home for dinner. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this from happening, the person whose professional purpose is to stand between the plant's violations and their consequences for the surrounding community, is Homer Simpson, a man whose own creator has stated has an IQ of 55. A man who, in the episode where a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood is temporarily removed, demonstrates the cognitive capacity of someone functioning at the level of a clinical disability. A man who sleeps at his workstation, who eats donuts during reactor warning alarms, who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core on the theory that it might grow larger. This is the person standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. He has been standing there for more than 3 decades. He will continue to stand there, presumably, for as long as the show continues to produce episodes. The 342 violations are his responsibility. The luminous rats are his responsibility. The gum on the cooling towers is his responsibility. And he is asleep in his chair. This is the context in which we return to the yellow skin. The evidence for what the plant has been doing to Springfield's population exists within the show's own canon, presented directly and without equivocation. The first visible mutant in Springfield's wildlife appears in Season 2. Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is pulled from a river near the power plant and immediately becomes a political and media event within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence that Mr. Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate it is safe for consumption. He eats it. The political situation is diffused. Springfield moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts a long-term study of the wildlife near the plant. Nobody asks the question that the three-eyed fish is making visually obvious. If the fish have 3 eyes from drinking this water, what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The show lets you sit with that unasked question. It introduces the three-eyed fish, lets the political story around it play out, and then lets the silence around the obvious follow-up question speak for itself. The fish is there, the question is there. Springfield chooses not to ask it. Springfield chooses not to ask it in every subsequent episode for the next 34 years. But the question's answer is also there, sitting in plain sight, in every frame of every episode. The yellow skin, the 4-fingered hands, the overbites that suggest altered skeletal development, the eyes that protrude slightly from the orbital structure of the skull, the hair that maintains its shape without product. These are not random aesthetic choices that happen to be assigned to the characters of Springfield. Within the show's own established logic, a logic it built carefully and consistently across its early seasons, these are what people look like when the fish in their river have 3 eyes. And here is the detail that makes this reading click into absolute place. When someone from outside Springfield visits, they don't look like this. Their features are more normally proportioned. Their eyes sit more naturally in their faces. Their skin tone reflects greater variation. They look, by comparison to the people who have been living in Springfield all their lives, like people who have not been drinking the same water. The show draws a visual distinction between inside the contamination zone and outside it. Inside, yellow, 4-fingered, overbitted, bulging-eyed. Outside, more normally proportioned, more variable in coloring, not obviously affected. The visual grammar of the show is encoding the radiation theory directly into its character designs. It has been doing so since the very first episode. The fact that this encoding was probably not fully intentional, that Matt Groening's original rationale for the yellow skin was commercial rather than narrative, makes it more interesting rather than less. The show may have accidentally built a coherent biological and environmental logic into its visual vocabulary. The commercial decision about skin color and the narrative decision about nuclear contamination, made at different points in the show's development, happen to be compatible in a way that generates a coherent reading of what is happening in Springfield. Or the show's writers discovered this compatibility over time and began, consciously or semi-consciously, to develop it. The evidence suggests an increasing self-awareness on the show's part about the implications of its own visual choices. The Blinky episode is too carefully constructed, too precisely parallel to the visual logic of the character's own physical appearance to be entirely accidental. The episode that establishes Mr. Burns as someone who requires weekly radiation treatments to survive, and who wanders the woods near Springfield emitting a visible green glow after each treatment, is too directly connected to the contamination narrative to be coincidence. The show knows what it has been building. It has just never said it out loud. And this silence is itself meaningful, because it is of a piece with Springfield's own collective silence about what the plant has been doing. The show refuses to say what its own visual logic implies about its characters, for the same reason that Springfield refuses to test the water after finding a three-eyed fish, saying it would require something to change, and Springfield is not a town that changes. The yellow skin is the most visible symptom of the most significant fact about Springfield. And the most significant fact about Springfield is that the town is too damaged in too many layered and mutually reinforcing ways to recognize its own damage. The very faculty that would allow recognition has been compromised by the thing that needs to be recognized, which is a sentence that would be depressing if we thought too hard about it. So we won't. We'll let it settle into the background, the way the show lets it settle, and we'll move on to the next thread. But before we do, just notice, the next time you're watching an episode, the skin, the four fingers, the eyes, notice who looks like that and who doesn't. Notice where the visual distinction falls. And notice that the show has been telling you something in every frame for 36 years that it has never found the words to say directly. The fish has 3 eyes. Everything else follows. Drop a comment with your time and location. It's always nice to know who's awake in Springfield with us. And subscribe if you want more nights like this one. The next section will be here when you're ready. Section 2. The Continuity Graveyard. Everything the show said and then forgot. There is a particular comfort in a show whose patterns you know well enough that it functions as wallpaper. The jokes land before you consciously register them. The emotional beats arrive where you expect them. The rhythm of the episodes, the setup, the escalation, the resolution, the couch gag that varies and the family that doesn't becomes a kind of background music for whatever else your evening is doing. This is not a criticism. This is, in fact, one of the most valuable things a television show can become. Familiar enough to be company without requiring your full attention. The Simpsons is very good at being this kind of company. It has had 36 years to practice. The rhythms are deeply embedded. The characters are more familiar than most people you know. And somewhere underneath all of that familiarity, underneath the accumulated warmth of a show that has been part of your life for longer than you've been an adult, there is a graveyard. The continuity graveyard is where The Simpsons buries the things it said and then needed to unsay. The facts it established and then contradicted. The characters it built and then simplified. The histories it constructed and then revised. The graveyard is large. It has been receiving residents for 3.5 decades and it is nowhere near full. We are going to spend some time there tonight. Not to be macabre about it, but because what is buried in the continuity graveyard tells you a great deal about what the show valued and what it was willing to sacrifice, and the pattern of those choices is one of the most revealing things about what The Simpsons is at its core. Let's begin with Homer's past, because Homer's past is the most extensively revised, most thoroughly contradicted, and most instructively inconsistent element in the show's entire canon. The version of Homer Simpson's childhood that the show established in its first several seasons was specific and careful and grounded in a particular American historical moment. Homer was born in the early 1950s. His parents were Abe and Mona Simpson. His childhood was shaped by the specific cultural atmosphere of the 1950s and 1960s, the post-war prosperity, the Cold War anxiety sitting underneath the suburban optimism, the particular quality of American childhood in an era of fallout drills and howdy doody, and the first faint tremors of cultural change that would become, in Homer's adolescence, the earthquake of the late 60s. His formative years, his adolescence, his first relationships, the moments that shaped the person he became were the late 1960s and early 1970s. He remembers music from that period. He has cultural reference points from that era. His sense of what counts as contemporary, what counts as old, what counts as the specific nostalgic currency of his particular generation. All of this was calibrated to the experience of a man who came of age in Nixon's America. who was a young adult during Watergate, who is, in the show's first decade, the kind of person who has that specific relationship with a specific decade. This was not an accident of production. The show's early writers were, in many cases, of an age to have personal investment in that era, or were at least writing with the specific intent of grounding Homer's character in a real cultural history. The jokes that land in early Homer flashbacks land because they are accurate to a real experience that real people had. The 1970s cultural details are not arbitrary background dressing. They are the specific soil in which Homer's specific character grew. And then the show kept running. The floating timeline, the structural commitment to treating the show's present, as always the viewer's present, to keeping the characters permanently at their established ages, regardless of how many years the show runs, created a problem that the show's writers addressed by revising Homer's past. If Homer is still in his mid-30s in 1995, he cannot have been a teenager in the late 1960s. If he is still mid-30s in 2005, he would have been born in the late 1960s, which means his formative years were the 1980s. By 2015, the arithmetic places his adolescence in the 1990s. By 2025, he is a man whose formative years were the 2000s. The show addressed this not by acknowledging the contradiction and finding a creative solution, but by simply revising the flashbacks. Episodes in later seasons that depict Homer's youth show him in the 1980s, then the 1990s, then the 2000s. The music changes, the clothes change, the cultural references change. The specific quality of the era that formed Homer, the thing that made him who he is, the historical soil the character grew from, is replaced with a different era, and a different version of who Homer is, and a different set of formative influences that produce, in theory, the same person. Except they don't produce the same person. They produce a person who is recognizably Homer-shaped, but who is formed from different materials. And the different materials change the meaning of who he is in ways the show does not seem to notice or care about. The Homer who grew up in the late 1960s and early 1970s is a specific kind of American. His relationship with authority was formed by a decade when institutional authority was in the process of destroying itself. His emotional vocabulary was shaped by a culture trying to simultaneously express and suppress a generation's worth of feelings about violence and injustice, and the gap between American ideals and American reality. His sense of humor has the specific coloration of people who were young during a time when comedy was one of the few available languages for talking about things that couldn't be talked about directly. None of that applies to a Homer who grew up in the 1980s, or the 1990s, or the 2000s. Those eras produce different people, different relationships with authority, different emotional vocabularies, different senses of humor with different specific colorations. The show revised Homer's historical context without revisiting what that context produced in his character, because the show had already committed to who Homer is and needed his past to serve as origin story rather than explanation. The past became a prop, something to anchor character moments in specific historical settings, rather than the actual generative force that produced the person we have been watching for 36 years. This is the first and most fundamental entry in the continuity graveyard. Homer's past. Buried multiple times, replaced multiple times, each replacement slightly different from the last, each replacement incompatible with the others, all of them serving the current episode without serving the character's actual coherence. Marge's past has been revised in different but equally significant ways. The early show established Marge as a person who had genuine aspirations before marriage and children, aspirations that were not simply suspended but actively sacrificed in the service of the family she chose to build. She had artistic talent. Her painting is depicted in early episodes as serious and capable. She had a thoughtful, engaged mind that was capable of navigating complex ethical and political questions. She had, in the show's first seasons, a sense of something she might have been or done or become if the circumstances of her life had arranged themselves differently. This did not make the early show a critique of Marge's choices. She chose Homer deliberately. She built her family deliberately. The show honored those choices as real and valuable. But it also honored the complexity of what those choices cost her, the specific ambiguity of a life that is genuinely happy but also genuinely constrained, the particular emotional texture of being a person who knows you are capable of more than your current life requires, and who has, for reasons that are real and sufficient, accepted that constraint. This version of Marge was interesting specifically because of that complexity. You could watch her and feel both the genuine love she had for her family and the quiet, persistent presence of the things she had set aside. The ambiguity was productive. It made her someone you wanted to understand more fully. As the show ran longer, the ambiguity was eroded, not all at once, not through a single revisionary episode, but gradually, through the accumulation of storylines that depicted Marge's domestic life as progressively more clearly what she wants rather than what she has. Her professional aspirations, when they appear in later episodes, are treated more as temporary adventure than permanent identity. She tries something, it doesn't work out, she comes home satisfied. The sense of things set aside, of a life more limited than her capabilities would justify, becomes less and less present in the show's depiction of who she is. The specific backstory details that supported the earlier, more complex version of Marge were also revised. Her pre-Homer history has been told in ways that are not fully compatible across the show's run. The specific nature of what she was doing and wanting and planning before Homer entered her life has shifted depending on what the current episode needed. The ambitious, occasionally frustrated, quietly self-aware Marge of the early seasons has been gradually replaced by a Marge who is primarily Homer's wife and the family's center of patience, with less and less residue of the person she was before she became those things. This is a loss, not a catastrophic one. Marge remains an interesting character by the standards of animated television, but the specific depth that made her remarkable in the early seasons has been progressively reduced, and the reduction was achieved in part through the revision of her past, through the gradual replacement of a complex backstory with a simpler one. Bart's continuity issues are, in some ways, less about specific factual revision and more about the slow erosion of characterization that we discussed briefly in the previous section. But there are specific factual inconsistencies in Bart's established history that deserve attention alongside the characterization drift. Bart's academic record is the most obviously inconsistent element of his established character. The show is not internally consistent about what grade Bart is in, which is strange because this should be a fixed and easily maintained detail. He is 10 years old. He attends Springfield Elementary. His grade level should follow from his age without any ambiguity. But across the show's run, Bart has been depicted in different grades, has been held back in some episodes and not in others, has been described as having specific academic records that contradict other descriptions of his academic record. Some of this inconsistency is harmless. It is a cartoon. Precise grade level tracking is not the most important continuity commitment a show can make. But the inconsistency about Bart's academic situation matters more than it might in another show, because the show has constructed significant emotional stories around the specific nature of Bart's academic struggles. The specific episodes that address Bart's intelligence and his failures and his relationship with the school system derive their meaning from a particular understanding of who Bart is academically and why. When the specific details of that understanding are inconsistent, the emotional meaning of those episodes becomes slightly unmoored from its factual foundation. There are also inconsistencies in Bart's established relationships with specific teachers and authority figures that cannot all be reconciled into a coherent account of his school experience. His relationship with Principal Skinner has been depicted in ways that vary significantly depending on the episode's needs. Their dynamic has ranged from genuine mutual contempt to something approaching grudging respect to something approaching actual affection, without any clear developmental logic connecting the different versions. The show uses Skinner and Bart the way it uses most of its secondary character relationships, as a set of available registers that can be dialed to whatever frequency the current episode requires. When the story needs them to be adversarial, they are adversarial. When the story needs them to have a moment of connection, they have a moment of connection. The relationship does not develop. It cycles through its available configurations. This pattern, the cycling relationship that does not develop, that is available in multiple configurations simultaneously, that has no directional movement across the show's run, is one of the clearest markers of the show's structural limitations. Real relationships change. They are altered by shared experience. The things that happen between two people in an episode affect the dynamic of the next episode, even slightly, even subtly. They leave traces. In Springfield, relationships do not leave traces. Every episode begins with each relationship in the same baseline configuration it occupied in every previous episode. The experiences of last week's episode are not present this week. The dynamic is reset to its default. The continuity graveyard is full of these relationships. Homer and Mr. Burns have had dozens of individual interactions across the show's run, interactions that in a realistic world would have established a specific and evolving dynamic between them. Homer has saved Burns's life. Homer has been specifically the instrument of significant crises in Burns's career. Burns has occasionally shown something that, in the light of a particular episode, looks like recognition of Homer as a specific person rather than a faceless employee. None of these interactions have altered the fundamental dynamic of the relationship. Burns still cannot reliably remember Homer's name. Homer still regards Burns with a combination of fear and oblivious cheerfulness. The relationship cycles around this same configuration regardless of what has happened between them. This is not realistic. But The Simpsons was never trying to be realistic in a conventional sense. The question is whether the unrealism serves or undermines the show's deeper purposes. In the early seasons, the answer was often, it serves. The episodic reset of character relationships allowed the show to tell a wide variety of stories about its characters without being constrained by the accumulated weight of every previous story. Each episode could establish its own emotional context without requiring the characters to carry the history of all their previous interactions. This gave the show tremendous formal flexibility. But the flexibility had a cost that became more visible as the show ran longer. The relationships that should have been capable of depth and development were kept at a fixed level of complexity by the episodic reset. Homer and Marge's marriage cycled through its crisis and resolution structure repeatedly without the relationship actually developing. Bart's relationship with Skinner cycled through its adversarial configurations without either character being changed by the conflict. The family's relationship with Burns, the most loaded and complex relationship in the show's dramatic structure, given Burns's actual role in Homer's life and his family's history, never developed beyond the established dynamic of oblivious employee and disregarding employer. The graveyard holds all of these undeveloped possibilities. All the episodes that could have been, that the reset made impossible. All the versions of these characters that their accumulated experience would have produced if experience were allowed to accumulate. All the storylines that were approached, briefly, in individual episodes, and then set aside when the episode ended and the relationship reset to its default configuration. You can walk through the graveyard and read the headstones if you know where to look. The episode where Homer briefly achieves something at the plant that Burns acknowledges. The episode where Bart makes a genuine academic breakthrough that suggests a different relationship with learning than his default. The episode where Marge and Homer have a conversation so honest that it gestures toward a version of their relationship that has processed its history rather than simply cycling through it. These moments exist. They are in the show's archive, and they rest in the graveyard beside the episodes that followed them, in which none of it had happened. The continuity graveyard is not, in the end, a collection of mistakes. Most of what is buried there was buried deliberately by writers who understood the structural requirements of episodic animation and made conscious choices about what to preserve and what to let go. The graveyard is a record of those choices, and the pattern of the choices, the specific things that were always let go, the specific things that were always preserved, is the show's most honest account of what it cares about and what it was willing to sacrifice in order to keep going. What was always let go? Factual consistency, developmental character change, the accumulation of experience into altered dynamics. These things are in the graveyard, buried clean and marked with precise dates if you're patient enough to find them. What was always preserved? The emotional core. Homer loves Marge. That was never buried. Bart and Lisa's complicated sibling dynamic? The specific way they are too different to be easily close and too similar to be genuinely separated, that was never buried. The family's fundamental identity as a family, the sense that whatever happens in an episode, this specific group of people is going home together at the end of it, that was never buried. The graveyard holds the specific. It preserves the general. And the specific, in the end, is what makes anything true rather than merely recognizable. That is the cost of the continuity graveyard. The show traded specificity for durability. It bought 3.5 more decades of Homer and Marge by giving up the specific Homer and Marge of the first 10 years. The trade is visible. Some people think it was worth it, some people do not. Springfield neither knows nor cares what you think. It has never cared about the graveyard at all. Section 3. The secondary characters who make no sense. One of the things that made The Simpsons extraordinary in its early seasons was the richness and specificity of its supporting cast. Springfield felt, before the show began to strain under its own weight, like a genuinely populated place. The minor characters who furnished its background had the quality of people who existed when the camera wasn't on them, who had histories and habits and specific ways of occupying space that were the residue of lives lived rather than the product of animation instructions. When Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon was behind the counter of the Quickie Mart in a Season 2 or 3 episode, you had the sense that he had been behind that counter for years before the scene began. That the specific way he handed change or noticed a shoplifter or made a dry observation about the behavior of his customers was the product of a long accumulation of experience with exactly this kind of customer in exactly this kind of environment. He had depth. He had history. He was not a function disguised as a character. He was a character. This is a high bar to clear, even for the best television, and The Simpsons cleared it in its early seasons for a remarkable number of its secondary figures. Not all of them, not even most of them, if you're counting the true background residents who existed primarily as visual texture, but the dozen or so supporting characters who recurred with enough frequency to accumulate their own characterization: Apu, Wiggum, Ned, Krusty, Sideshow, Bob, Fat Tony, Barney, Kent Brockman, Reverend Lovejoy. These characters had, in the early show, a specificity and a humanity that is genuinely rare in American animation. The specificity was the product of writers who understood that secondary characters in a comedy need interiority to generate real comedy rather than just jokes. A character you understand completely can generate unexpected humor by behaving consistently with who they are in unexpected situations. A character you understand only superficially can only generate the humor of recognition. You laugh because you recognize the type, not because you recognize the specific person. The early Simpsons almost always generated humor of the specific person rather than the type. The difference is not subtle. It is the difference between a joke that makes you laugh and a joke that makes you laugh and then keeps resonating because it is true about someone in a way that goes beyond the surface. And then, gradually, almost all of the secondary characters lost this quality. The process was not uniform. It happened at different rates for different characters and through different mechanisms. But the endpoint for most of the show's major supporting cast was the same: the replacement of a specific person with a recognizable type. Let's work through the major secondary characters one by one, because each case is instructive in a different way. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon's trajectory is the most complicated because it accumulated cultural significance beyond the show itself that eventually overtook whatever the show was trying to do with the character. In the early seasons, Apu's backstory was developed with genuine care and intelligence. He had emigrated to America to study computer science at the Calcutta Technical Institute, which appears in early episodes as a prestigious institution. He was so committed to completing his doctorate, which required defending a dissertation to a committee composed of some of the most rigorous academics in his field, that he stayed in America past his visa, became undocumented, and worked at the Quickie Mart to support himself through years of study. He eventually completed his doctorate. He was, at the moment of first encountering the Simpson family, a man with a Ph.D. in computer science who was working in retail. The show treated this gap between his credentials and his employment with genuine intelligence. It was not played entirely for comedy. The show was interested in the specific experience of an immigrant whose qualifications from his home country do not translate directly into equivalent opportunity in his new one, who finds himself overqualified for the work he is doing, but committed to a community he has built through the years of doing it. This is a real experience. It is the experience of millions of immigrants to the United States across the country's entire history. The show gave it a specific face and a specific voice and made it funny and also true. What happened to Apu over time was gradual and cumulative. The doctorate disappeared from the character's profile. The specific complexity of his immigration history became background material that was referenced less and less frequently. The philosophical quality of his characterization, the dry, resigned humor of a highly educated man working a job below his abilities, finding meaning in the community of a convenience store, because meaning is always available if you're looking in the right direction, was progressively replaced by a set of more immediately recognizable attributes. The family, which arrived in a wedding episode that brought 8 children at once through a marriage arranged by Apu's parents in India, became a more prominent part of his characterization than his intellectual life had been. The character became more easily summarized. Fewer adjectives were required to describe him. Hard-working Indian immigrant who runs a convenience store, is married, has 8 children, says thank you, come again, is a recognizable type rather than a person. The cultural critique of the character, which was developed and publicized in the late 2010s, landed on this type rather than on the more complex person the show had attempted in the early years. The critique was accurate about what the character had become. It was less accurate, though not entirely inaccurate, about what the character had originally been. The problem with Apu was that the show had started with something more complicated and progressively simplified it until what remained was primarily the caricature. The caricature was always present, even in the early seasons. The accent, the cultural signifiers, the convenience store setting, these were the surface elements that the show used as the frame for a more interior characterization. But as the interior characterization faded, the surface elements became the whole picture. And a character who is only surface elements, whose depth has been simplified away, is more vulnerable to the critique of being a caricature because the only thing left to see is the caricature. Apu was eventually retired from significant storylines, not through a formal narrative conclusion, but through the gradual reduction of his presence that follows a controversy the show handled poorly. He did not get an ending. He did not get a final episode that honored what the character had been at its best. He simply appeared less and less frequently, and then not at all for extended periods. And his absence became the de facto resolution of a situation the show's creators were not equipped to resolve more gracefully. This is the most visible form of the secondary character problem in the show's history, but it is not the only one. Chief Clancy Wiggum deserves extended attention because his decline as a character is less about external controversy and more about the show's internal creative drift. The early Wiggum is a specific and rather brilliant comic creation. He is corrupt, but his corruption is the corruption of small-stakes civic decay rather than the corruption of genuine malevolence. He is incompetent, but his incompetence is the incompetence of a man who found his level and has settled into it with a comfort that borders on contentment. He is not stupid, exactly, he is lazy in a particular way, which is slightly different from stupid. He has the intelligence to know what he is not doing, and to not do it with some sophistication. His avoidance of work is effortful in its own way. The specific texture of early Wiggum's characterization generates comedy that the later, broader Wiggum cannot reach. When early Wiggum makes a spectacularly wrong deduction about a crime scene, the joke is not simply that he got it wrong. The joke is the specific way he got it wrong, the particular logic he applied, the specific failure mode of his approach, the way his conclusion is simultaneously completely incorrect and internally consistent with how a person with his specific combination of laziness, wishful thinking, and comfort with the path of least resistance would navigate the evidence. Later, Wiggum makes wrong deductions too, but the wrongness is more general. He is wrong in a generic bumbling cop way rather than in the specific Wiggum way. The comedy is the recognition of a type rather than the observation of a specific person. This distinction between the comedy of a specific person and the comedy of a recognizable type is the most important distinction in evaluating what happened to The Simpsons' secondary characters over the course of the show's run. The early show almost always generated the former. The later show almost always settled for the latter. And the reason is not a mystery. The former requires understanding your character deeply enough to generate behavior that is surprising but inevitable, that you could not have predicted, but that, once you see it, you recognize as exactly what this specific person would do in this situation. The latter requires only knowing the character's surface attributes well enough to reproduce them in a new context. Deep character understanding is labor-intensive. It requires writers who have spent time inside the character's perspective, who can inhabit the character's specific logic and emotional register, and generate behavior from within that logic, rather than from without. Surface attribute reproduction is faster and easier and, in the context of a production that needs to generate 20-plus episodes per season, much more practical. The Simpsons production demands were not compatible, in the long run, with the level of character understanding that the early show sustained. Not because the show's writers became less talented, but because the show's production demands remained constant, while the pool of writers who had internalized the characters at the necessary depth changed over time. Writers who had spent years developing their understanding of who Homer and Marge and Apu and Wiggum were cycled out of the writer's room. Writers who had inherited those characters from documentation and previous episodes cycled in. And documented characters are never as specific as lived ones. Ned Flanders' case is different from either Apu's or Wiggum's, and it deserves attention as the show's most sustained example of a secondary character whose depth was both properly utilized and later lost. The early show understood Ned in ways that it took years to fully reveal. In the first several seasons, Ned appears to function primarily as a foil for Homer, the good neighbor who is everything Homer is not, the devout and diligent and physically fit and financially responsible figure against whom Homer's laziness and irreverence and chaos are set in relief. He exists, apparently, to make Homer look worse by comparison, while also generating comedy from the gap between his relentless positivity and the world's consistent failure to reward it. But the show was doing something more sophisticated with Ned than the foil function suggests, and it revealed the full sophistication in the episode where a hurricane destroys his house and the town's incompetent rebuilding effort produces a structure that collapses almost immediately. Ned, who has absorbed every insult and every disappointment Springfield has produced for him, with grace and patience and a faith that has never wavered, breaks. He does not break quietly. He names every person who has ever wronged him and says specifically how they have wronged him, with an accuracy and a venom that is startling because nothing in his previous characterization suggested the capacity for it. And then he is hospitalized, committed. And the episode reveals what the show had been building toward. Ned's positivity is not a character trait. It is a behavioral modification protocol installed in him as a child by a well-intentioned but ultimately damaging psychiatric intervention. Ned was a feral child, uncontrollable, aggressive, incapable of accommodating the normal social demands of childhood. His beatnik parents, who did not believe in discipline, brought him to a child psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through what the episode describes as 8 months of continuous therapy, a process that the doctor himself acknowledges, when asked whether he was successful, by saying that he may have overcorrected. The overcorrection is Ned's entire personality. His kindness is the scar tissue of removed rage. His patience is the programmed suppression of impulses that, in a child who had them, were apparently significant enough to require 8 months of intensive modification. His faith is, in part, the external framework that a person with no internal permission to feel certain emotions needs in order to have a stable understanding of why suffering is acceptable and why one should continue behaving well in its presence. This revelation does not destroy Ned Flanders. It deepens him. It makes everything you have seen him do in previous episodes land differently, with new weight and new resonance. The forgiveness he extended to Homer after Homer's selfishness caused his wife's death is viewed through this lens, not saintly. It is the programmed response of a person who cannot allow himself to feel the rage that the situation would ordinarily generate. The faith that sustains him through loss after loss is the architecture of a person who needed an external system to manage what his internal system cannot process. The show understood this about Ned and used it with precision in the episode that revealed it. And in the seasons that followed, the show occasionally returned to this understanding. There are flickers of the suppressed Ned, the person underneath the programming, in various later episodes. But the full depth of the character that the episode revealed was not consistently sustained in Ned's subsequent appearances. He became, progressively, more primarily a character defined by his religious conservatism than by the specific psychological complexity that made that conservatism meaningful. The religious conservatism without the psychological context is a type, a stock character, a recognizable representative of a position rather than a specific human being whose position is the product of a specific and complicated history. And that is, in the end, what happened to Ned. Not that the show forgot what it had built, but that it did not consistently use what it had built. It returned to the simpler version because the simpler version was more deployable. Krusty the Clown is the secondary character whose potential was most thoroughly used and then most completely abandoned. The early show's understanding of Krusty was genuinely remarkable. It is, in the context of the show's entire run, one of the most complete and compassionate depictions of show business psychology that American television has produced. The insight at the center of the Krusty characterization is this: he is a man whose entire public existence is performance, who has been performing for so long and with such commitment that he has lost access to whatever was underneath the performance before it began. The gap between Krusty the Clown, cheerful, energetic, the beloved face of children's entertainment, and Herschel Schmoikel Krustofsky, cynical, self-destructive, estranged from his heritage, dependent on the specific forms of stimulation that his profession gives him access to, is not played purely for comedy. The show is genuinely interested in the gap, in what it costs to perform that completely for that long. The episode in which Krusty and his father reconcile the rabbi, voiced by Jackie Mason, the estrangement built over decades of a son who chose the clown over the congregation, is the finest use of this characterization. The specific thing Krusty sacrificed to be the clown was not just his father's approval. It was a version of himself that was connected to something larger than entertainment, that had a relationship to community and tradition, and the specific forms of meaning that religious life provides. He traded that for fame and money and the specific satisfaction of making people laugh. The episode does not judge this trade. It simply shows you its cost, and it shows you Krusty trying to recover something of what he gave up in the specific late-life way that people who traded one thing for another sometimes try to recover the lost thing when the gains of the trade begin to feel insufficient. The reconciliation is not triumphant. It is tender and slightly broken, the way real reconciliations between people who have been separated by pride and time usually are. This is remarkable television, and the show produced it, and then largely moved on from the understanding that produced it. Later, Krusty episodes use the character without accessing this depth. They know that Krusty is cynical and self-destructive and that his show business persona is a mask, but they use this knowledge in service of jokes about show business rather than in service of genuine character exploration. Krusty became the show's vehicle for entertainment industry satire rather than the deeply felt portrait of a specific kind of human compromise that he had been at his best. The secondary characters of The Simpsons are a gallery of what the show was capable of and what it chose to do with what it was capable of. In the early seasons, it chose depth and specificity and the slow revelation of human complexity. In the later seasons, it chose efficiency and recognizability and the reliable deployment of established attributes. Both choices generated their own kind of comedy, but only one of them generated the kind of comedy that stays with you. That makes you laugh and then, an hour later, or a day later, or years later, makes you think. That puts something in your understanding of the world that was not there before. That is what the early secondary characters of The Simpsons did, and the loss of it is real, even if it is the kind of loss that is easier to name after the fact than to prevent in the forward motion of a production that must keep producing. Section 4. The Marriage of Homer and Marge. All the versions, there is no story the show returns to more reliably, across its entire run, than the story of how Homer and Marge fell in love. This is not accidental. It is the show's clearest acknowledgement of what it understands to be the emotional core of everything it does. If the show has a thesis, if a comedy about a yellow cartoon family can be said to have a thesis, the thesis is about what it means to be with someone, to choose someone, to keep choosing someone imperfectly and repeatedly over the course of a life. The show has told the story of Homer and Marge finding each other at least 6 distinct times, in meaningfully different configurations, across its 3.5 decades of episodes. And the differences between those configurations are not simply the continuity errors of a long-running show that cannot keep track of its own history. They are, when you examine them together, a record of what the show believes about love and what it was willing to revise versus what it treated as inviolable. The canonical origin of Homer and Marge's relationship, established in the Season 2 episode The Way We Was, places their first meeting in a high school detention room in the year 1974. The specific detail of 1,974 matters. The show was conscious of the historical moment it was using. 1974 is a specific year in American history. The year of Nixon's resignation. The year the Vietnam War was in its final disastrous phase. The year that many Americans were discovering that the institutions they had been taught to trust had been systematically lying to them. It is also, in the cultural memory of people who were teenagers then, the year of a specific quality of music and fashion and social energy that is not interchangeable with any other year. Homer is in detention for smoking. Marge is in detention for burning her bra in protest of the school's dress code, which required girls to wear dresses and skirts without offering a parallel constraint on boys. This is the show's signal that Marge has political consciousness, that she is not simply a passive figure waiting to be shaped by whoever comes into her life, but someone who has her own sense of what is just and her own willingness to act on that sense, even at personal cost. They meet because they are both being punished for acts of rebellion, his trivial and self-indulgent, hers principled and briefly consequential. This framing is precise and meaningful. The show is telling you, from the very first meeting, something about what this relationship is and what it requires of both of them. His capacity to need her in the undefended way of someone who has nothing to protect, and her capacity to see something worth protecting in him. Homer is immediately and completely in love with her. Not the tentative, uncertain love of someone testing the waters. The immediate, unequivocal, I have never been more sure of anything love that certain people experience and that most people are skeptical about because it seems too complete and too sudden to be reliable. Homer is not skeptical. Homer experiences the feeling and names it to himself with the same directness he brings to every other experience. I love her. Marge is not immediately in love with Homer. She is not uninterested in him. There is something she responds to in his directness and his specific kind of helplessness, but she does not feel what he feels when he feels it. She is interested. She is not captured. The episode turns on an elaborate scheme Homer undertakes to spend time with Marge. He pretends to need a French tutor when he actually speaks French perfectly well, specifically so that she will agree to meet with him regularly. The scheme is revealed. Marge feels manipulated. She rejects him. Homer watches from a distance as she goes to prom with Artie Ziff, intelligent, accomplished, socially confident Artie Ziff, who is in every conventional sense the better choice. And then the episode's final movement, which is the most emotionally precise thing the show did in its first several years. Marge is in Artie Ziff's car after prom. Artie is attempting to be intimate with her in a way she is not welcoming. She gets out of the car, and as she walks home through the Springfield night, she passes Homer's house. Homer is sitting on the front porch in his tuxedo, the tuxedo he wore to a prom nobody invited him to, waiting without knowing he is waiting for something that may not come. She stops. She goes to him. Not because the evening with Artie has been terrible enough to make Homer look good by comparison, because something about Homer sitting on the porch in his tuxedo, hoping in his specific, undefended way, is the most honest thing she has encountered all evening, and she is someone who responds to honesty even when honesty is not glamorous. She chose him. The episode makes it clear that this is a choice with alternatives. Artie Ziff is a real alternative, shown with sufficient specificity that you understand exactly what Marge is setting aside. The choice is not made from lack of options. It is made from preference. From something she sees in Homer that she does not see in the more conventionally appealing choice. This version of the Homer and Marge origin story is the foundation. It is the one the show returns to as the emotional reference point for the relationship in all of its subsequent storytelling. And it is built from a specific historical moment and a specific set of cultural conditions that, because of the floating timeline, the show could not maintain. The second telling of the origin story comes in the Season 3 episode I Married Marge, which actually depicts events that precede the way we was in narrative terms the courtship after high school, the accidental pregnancy, Homer's decision to marry Marge and take the job at the power plant. This episode places the romantic escalation in the late 1970s and early 1980s, after disco and before the Reagan era had fully settled into the cultural atmosphere. It shows Homer proposing to Marge at a miniature golf course, an impulsive, informal proposal from someone who does not know how to make grand gestures, but who is completely genuine in his commitment. The episode is important for what it establishes about Homer's decision-making at this stage of his life. He does not take the job at the plant because he wants it. He takes it because Marge is pregnant and he needs to provide, and the plant is what is available. The job is a constraint accepted freely, which is different from a job chosen. Homer's entire career at the Springfield nuclear power plant began with an act of love expressed through a sacrifice that he made without drama or self-pity. The third version of the origin story begins to appear in later seasons as the floating timeline requires the historical backdrop to shift forward. Flashback episodes from the mid to late 1990s onward begin to update the cultural setting of Homer and Marge's courtship without updating its emotional content. The same basic narrative: Homer loves Marge immediately and completely. Marge comes to love Homer through recognition of something genuine, is restaged in settings drawn from the 1980s, the 1990s, and eventually the 2000s. The cultural details are different in each version. The music is different, the clothes are different, the specific references are different, but the emotional content is reproduced faithfully across each revision. This tells you something important. The show knew which elements of the origin story were essential and which were contextual, and it protected the essential ones even as it revised the contextual ones. The essential elements are the immediacy and completeness of Homer's feeling, the deliberateness of Marge's choice, the presence of an alternative that Marge consciously sets aside, and the specific quality of what she sees in Homer that makes the choice make sense. These elements are present in every version of the story, in every decade the show reimagines it in. They are the show's theory of what this specific love is and why it persists. The contextual elements, the specific year, the specific music, the specific cultural backdrop, are the elements the show sacrifices to the floating timeline without apparent distress. They are the scaffolding around the emotional architecture, and when the architecture requires new scaffolding, the old scaffolding is removed and replaced. This is a coherent and defensible approach to managing the contradiction between a fixed emotional story and a shifting historical context. But it has a cost that the show does not fully acknowledge. The contextual elements of the original 1974 telling are not fully separable from its emotional content. The specific qualities of Marge's proto-feminist gesture in 1974, burning her bra in an era when the women's movement was actively reshaping the social landscape, carry a meaning that is not preserved. When the gesture is reimagined in 1985 or 1993, the specific cultural atmosphere of 1974 America shapes the emotional register of the story in ways that a different year cannot fully replicate. The Way We Was is not just an emotional story. It is an emotional story that is deeply embedded in a specific historical moment, and the specificity of the moment is part of what makes the emotion feel real rather than generic. When the moment is revised, when the setting is updated to maintain the arithmetic of the floating timeline, the emotion is preserved, but something of its rootedness is lost. The later versions of the origin story are emotionally faithful to the original. They are historically hollowed. They tell the same story in a different setting, and the different setting cannot fully replicate what the original setting contributed. The show's characters fall in love in a historical vacuum in the general 1980s, the general 1990s, the general 2000s, rather than in the specific 1974, that made the story feel like something that had actually happened to actual people. The fourth and fifth versions of the origin story involve specific complications and retcons that the show introduced in later seasons, some of which are compatible with the original versions and some of which are not. There are episodes in later seasons that complicate the question of when Homer and Marge first became an official couple, that introduce gaps or separations in their early relationship that are not fully consistent with the unbroken continuity of the original telling, that expand or revise Artie Ziff's role in ways that affect the meaning of Marge's original choice. These later complications are generally less emotionally focused than the original version. They are produced by a writer's room that is using the origin story as a plot resource rather than as the emotional foundation it originally was. The complications generate episode content without generating the kind of emotional resonance that the original telling generated. The sixth version is not a specific episode but the accumulated state of the origin story after all of the revisions and complications. A story that everyone knows the emotional content of, but that has been told in so many different contextual configurations that no single telling can be pointed to as the definitive one. The year of Homer and Marge's first meeting is somewhere between the early 1970s and the late 2000s, depending on the episode. The specific circumstances have variations across multiple tellings. The emotional content is constant. What this produces, ultimately, is an origin story that functions more as myth than as history. Myth does not have a single authoritative version. It exists in multiple compatible and incompatible tellings, none of which is definitive, all of which are oriented around the same core of meaning. The story of Homer and Marge falling in love is, by the show's later seasons, functioning as myth rather than as narrative fact. A story whose truth is not in its specific details but in its emotional logic, which is reproduced faithfully across every telling regardless of what the specific details are. This is a form of success, in a sense. The show managed to maintain the emotional truth of the origin story across 3.5 decades of revision, which is genuinely difficult. But it is also, in another sense, a surrender. The specific historical grounding that made the original telling feel real, the thing that made The Way We Was feel like something that had happened rather than something that was always happening, was lost to the floating timeline, and the myth that replaced it, while emotionally true, is thinner and less rooted than what it replaced. Homer and Marge fell in love in 1974, except when they fell in love in 1982. Except when they fell in love in the 1990s. They always fell in love in detention, over French tutoring, over a miniature golf course, somewhere, sometime, in the general direction of the past. The specific year is in the graveyard. The feeling is not. Section 5. Springfield's economy and the math that never works out. Homer Simpson's annual salary at the Springfield nuclear power plant has been cited in various episodes at various figures, but the most commonly referenced number established in an episode where a pay stub or financial document is briefly visible is approximately $24,000 per year. This figure has been adjusted upward in some episodes, adjusted downward in others, and treated with the same casual inconsistency that governs every other specific numerical fact in the show's universe. But let's use $24,000 as a baseline, because it is the number the show most often seems to be working from, and because what $24,000 per year cannot explain about Homer Simpson's life is one of the most illuminating inconsistencies in the show's entire history. $24,000 per year, in the decade in which the show was originally set, placed Homer slightly below the median American household income. This was intentional. Homer was designed to be a working-class figure, a representative of the economic stratum that constitutes the majority of American workers, people who earn enough to keep the lights on and not much more, who live with the permanent low-grade financial anxiety of a household whose income exactly meets its obligations with little margin for the unexpected. The Simpson family home at 742 Evergreen Terrace is a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in a suburban neighborhood. In the television universe, this is a modest but comfortable home. In the actual American real estate market of any decade in which the show has aired, it is a home that Homer Simpson's salary could not purchase. The mortgage alone, at any reasonable interest rate for any reasonable purchase price for a house of those dimensions in a suburban American setting, would consume a portion of Homer's pre-tax income that would make the basic costs of maintaining a family of 5 in that house mathematically impossible. The show is aware of this. In various episodes, Homer's financial anxiety is treated as genuine and dramatically significant. He cannot afford things. He worries about money. He makes decisions about expenditure that only make sense in the context of genuine financial constraint. The show wants you to feel the real economic pressure that working-class American families live under. And then Homer is at an expensive restaurant, or the family is taking a vacation that implies significant disposable income, or a plot development requires money to be available, and the financial constraint evaporates because the plot needs it to. The economy of Homer's household, like the economy of Springfield more broadly, is whatever the current episode requires it to be. This inconsistency is, on one level, simply the standard television cartoon problem of maintaining economic plausibility in a world where the plots need to go to places that real working-class incomes do not permit. The show does not want to be constrained to stories that are narratively possible on $24,000 a year, so it maintains the appearance of financial constraint when the appearance is useful and sets it aside when it is not. But the inconsistency is more interesting when you look at its specific pattern. The show maintains financial constraint most consistently in the earlier seasons, when the show was most interested in the specific texture of working-class American life. Homer's anxiety about money in a season 2 or 3 episode has a specificity and a weight that is grounded in something real. You can feel the specific quality of financial stress that the show is depicting, the way it shapes daily decisions and creates low-grade constant pressure. As the seasons progress and the show's interests shift toward adventure and celebrity and increasingly surreal plot lines, the financial grounding loosens. The specific weight of Homer's economic situation becomes less consistently present. When financial constraint does appear in later seasons, it tends to be more mechanical, a plot device that generates the need for a specific story rather than a genuine texture of daily experience. This is another version of the continuity drift we have been tracking. The early show understood Homer's economic position and used it as the foundation for character behavior. The later show knows Homer's economic position as a fact about his character and deploys it when useful. But let's follow the specific economic logic of Springfield more broadly, because the macroeconomics of the town is at least as interesting as Homer's household budget and considerably stranger. The Springfield nuclear power plant is the town's primary employer. This is established in the early seasons and maintained across the show's entire run. The plant employs a significant fraction of Springfield's working population. Its payroll constitutes a substantial portion of the economic activity that flows through the town. Its continued operation is, in the show's terms, something close to a precondition for Springfield's economic survival. Mr. Burns owns the plant. Burns is a billionaire. His wealth is vast enough that the show often treats specific dollar amounts as effectively meaningless. In his context, he has so much money that the concept of a price has become abstract, that he has not handled currency in so long that he does not know what ordinary things cost, that his decision-making about money operates on a scale where the difference between $1 million and $10 million is a rounding error. The economic relationship between Burns and Springfield is a relationship of dependency that the show has depicted carefully enough that its implications are hard to avoid. Springfield needs the plant to survive economically. The plant operates at the sufferance of Burns. Burns operates according to his own interests, which are not reliably aligned with the interests of Springfield's population. The town's economic survival is therefore permanently contingent on the continued willingness of one privately motivated billionaire to keep making the decisions that allow it to survive. This is not a stable economic arrangement. It is the definition of a captured economy, an economy whose functioning depends on the choices of a single powerful actor who faces no competitive pressure and no meaningful accountability. Burns can raise prices. He can cut employment. He can make decisions about the plant's operation that damage the community without facing meaningful consequences, because the community's dependence on the plant limits its ability to exercise countervailing power. The show knows this and has depicted its consequences in various ways across its run. The episode in which Burns attempts to block out the sun to force Springfield's residents to buy their electricity from his plant is the most extreme version of the rent extraction relationship the show has established. But the more ordinary version of the same dynamic, Burns making decisions about the plant's operation that serve his interests at the expense of the community's health and safety, is present in the show's basic premise. What the show does not do, across its entire run, is draw the explicit connection between Springfield's economic structure and the specific harms that structure enables. The contamination of Springfield's environment by the plant's violations is presented in the show as a series of specific incidents: Blinky, the inspector's violations list, the dome, in the movie, rather than as the systematic consequence of an economic arrangement that allows Burns to externalize the costs of his operation onto the community that depends on him. The show knows the facts. It does not connect them into the causal chain they form. And the failure to connect them is itself a form of the collective denial that defines Springfield's relationship with its own reality. The fish has 3 eyes, Burns has no regulations, the workers have no power. These facts sit in the same universe, and the show does not draw the line between them. The broader economic life of Springfield beyond the plant is depicted with a similar combination of specific attention and systematic vagueness. The Quick E-Mart is a specific place with specific economic logic, a convenience store operating in a market where convenience commands a premium staffed by someone whose labor cost is reduced by his ownership stake. Moe's Tavern is a specific place with specific economic logic, a neighborhood bar operating on thin margins, serving a captive clientele of regulars whose loyalty is more reliable than their bill sizes. The show uses these locations with genuine care as economic settings. Moe's specific financial precarity, the sense that the bar is always one slow month from closing, is used in various episodes as both comedy and genuine character texture. The economic situation of a small business operating on thin margins in a community that does not have great economic vitality is present in the show's treatment of Moe's in ways that feel true. But the broader economic life of Springfield, the aggregate picture of how the town functions as an economy, how its various parts relate to each other, how the money flows and where it accumulates, and what the structure of economic power in the community actually is, this is never developed into a coherent picture. The town has businesses. The businesses have customers. The money circulates in ways the show never traces. What the show does trace, consistently and with significant attention, is the economic relationship between the Simpson family and the broader economic forces that shape their lives. Homer's salary is the thing that cannot quite pay for the life his family lives. Burns is the entity that controls that salary, and, by extension, the family's economic security. The town is the context in which this specific dependency is lived out on a daily basis. The family's economic situation is the show's real economic subject, not the macroeconomics of Springfield. The microeconomics of one working-class family trying to live a life that is slightly beyond what their income technically permits, in a town where the only real power belongs to someone who has no particular reason to care about their welfare. This is, again, a recognizable reality for a significant portion of the American working class. The show captures it accurately, if inconsistently. And the inconsistency, the way the financial constraint appears and disappears depending on the episode's needs, is, in a strange way, also true to the experience. Working-class financial anxiety is not constant. It oscillates. There are periods of relative ease and periods of genuine crisis. The show's oscillation between depicting Homer's financial constraint and ignoring it may be more accurate to the lived experience of working-class economic life than a more consistently grim picture would be. But the oscillation also prevents the show from ever fully reckoning with what Homer's economic situation means. What it means to work your entire adult life at a job you did not choose for a man who does not know your name, for wages that never quite keep pace with the life you are trying to live, in a town whose economy is controlled by that same man and whose institutions are shaped by his interests rather than yours. Springfield's economy is a story the show has been telling, in pieces, for 36 years, without ever telling it whole. The pieces are all there. The specific salary, the specific employer, the specific structure of dependency, the specific consequences of that structure for the environment and the health and the institutional life of the community. They are all there, scattered across 800 episodes, waiting to be connected. The show never connects them. That is, in the end, the most honest thing about Springfield's economy. It depicts the conditions of a company town with great accuracy and then declines to conclude what a company town is. Section 6. The children who were never allowed to grow. There is a moment in the show's 6th season, an episode called Lisa's Wedding, where the show does something it almost never does. It allows time to pass. It lets the future happen. It projects forward to the year 2010, still in the future when the episode aired in 1995, and shows us Lisa Simpson as a young woman of 23, studying at a prestigious British university, engaged to a cultured young man named Hugh Parkfield, who is intellectually her equal in ways that nobody in Springfield has ever managed to be. The episode is careful and specific about the person Lisa became when the show finally let her grow. She is recognizable as herself. The intelligence is intact. The ethical seriousness is intact. The particular quality of her melancholy is still there, sitting behind her eyes, but she has been changed by time in ways that feel completely true to who the early show established her to be. She left Springfield. She found a wider world. She discovered that the wider world had more room for her than her hometown did. She loves her family and also finds them genuinely difficult to return to, which is not the same as not loving them. The episode depicts the specific emotional complexity of someone who made it out, returning home for a family event, navigating the gap between who she has become and who the people she loves have remained. Homer is still Homer, Marge is still Marge, Springfield is still Springfield, and Lisa moves through it with the careful tenderness of a person who knows that home can be both the most meaningful place in the world and the place most likely to reduce you back to whoever you were before you figured out who you actually are. And then the episode ends. Lisa is 8 years old again. The reset is not apologized for. The episode was explicitly framed as a vision of one possible future, not canonical, subject to change, available for revision, so it does not count. Lisa goes back to 3rd grade. The wedding does not happen. Hugh Parkfield retreats into the undiscovered country of futures the show is not prepared to deliver. Everything resets. And the following week, the family is back on the couch. The show has opened this particular window more times than you might expect from a series, so structurally committed to keeping its characters at fixed ages. Lisa's possible futures have been depicted in multiple episodes, from multiple angles in multiple configurations. In some, she is a senator. In some, she becomes a Buddhist nun. In some, she is a scientist, or a writer, or a professor, or a musician playing to audiences that actually understand what she is doing. The show has imagined her future with genuine creative investment across decades of storytelling, and it has taken every single version of that future back. Every glimpse has closed. Every briefly imagined adult has been folded back into the eternal 8-year-old. The window opens, shows you something true and specific about who this person would become given time, and then closes, and Lisa is in 3rd grade again. What does it mean to keep imagining futures and then erasing them? The most sympathetic reading situates this pattern within the emotional logic of what the show, consciously or not, understands about its own nature. A dreaming mind frozen at the moment it lost consciousness cannot project its loved ones forward into a future it was not present for. Homer cannot imagine Lisa at 23 because Homer has never seen Lisa at 23. The dream can only contain what the dreamer knew. The futures the show imagines are the dream reaching toward the edges of its constraint and finding the boundary. This is as far forward as the sleeping mind can go, before the projection fails, and the children snap back to the ages they were when the dream began. But even without any coma theory framework, the pattern carries meaning. The show keeps imagining its children's futures and keeps withdrawing them because withdrawal is the show's honest acknowledgement of what it is doing to these people. It knows what Bart and Lisa would become. It has imagined those futures with enough care that the imagined versions are specific and plausible, clearly the products of the childhoods the show has depicted. And it knows that actually delivering those futures, letting Bart graduate from high school, letting Lisa go to college, letting Maggie learn to speak would change what the show is in ways the show is not prepared to sustain. So the children are held in amber, preserved at the moment before their specific futures become inevitable. Bart Simpson, at the time this is being written, is approximately 46 years old by real-world calendar reckoning, if we count from his established birth year in the show's early seasons. He is 10 years old. He has been 10 for his entire adult life in the real world. He will, in all probability, still be 10 when people who are not yet born watch the show decades from now. What would Bart be at 46? The show has answered this question in various flash-forward episodes, and the answers tend toward the melancholy end of plausibility. Adult Bart is usually struggling. He has not found the thing that would use what he actually has. The specific intelligence that made the early Bart fascinating, practical, street-level, socially acute, capable of improvising solutions to problems that stumped more formally educated people, has not found a legitimate channel. He is funny in a sad way. He is recognizably himself, but diminished by the long failure to become what his capabilities suggested he could become. This is the show being honest, in its flash-forward episodes, about what Springfield produces in the people who stay. Keeping Bart at 10 is a form of mercy alongside everything else it is. As long as he is 10, he has not yet become the slightly sad adult the flash-forwards show. The future is still open. The worst versions of adult Bart remain unmanifested. He is preserved at the age of genuine possibility, in the specific moment before possibility has been foreclosed by the specific failure of his environment to develop what he has. But preserved in possibility is not the same as having possibility realized. Bart at 10 permanently, is a character for whom potential is perpetually available and perpetually inaccessible. He can have breakthroughs in individual episodes, moments where his intelligence finds expression, where his creativity is recognized and appreciated, where the gap between who he is and who his environment allows him to be briefly closes. And then the episode ends and the gap reopens and he is back at baseline. He is the character the show keeps rescuing from his own future by never allowing the future to happen. Lisa's situation is different and in some ways more difficult. Lisa at 8 is not simply preserved in the moment before possibility forecloses. She is in the moment of maximum mismatch between her capabilities and her environment. She is old enough to understand how limited her options are and too young to do anything about the limitation. She is old enough to care deeply about things she cannot change, and too young to develop the kind of strategic detachment that allows a person to survive caring deeply about things they cannot change without being continuously damaged by. The gap. The show has made Lisa's ongoing suffering the most consistent and carefully observed thread in its entire run. Not the dramatic suffering of acute crisis, though that is also present in various episodes, but the low-grade, persistent, structural suffering of a person who is too aware and too young and too stuck to do anything constructive with her awareness. Every episode where she sees something clearly that everyone around her refuses to see. Every episode where she tries to communicate something true and is dismissed. Every episode where the specific forms of connection she needs, intellectual, musical, genuinely reciprocal, are briefly available and then withdrawn. The suffering is never catastrophic. It is constant, and the show depicts it with a consistency that honors its reality. Keeping Lisa at 8 is the show's acknowledgement that it cannot give her what her character arc implies she needs. The adult Lisa of Lisa's Wedding is a person who escaped Springfield and found a larger world. That is the resolution her 8-year-old suffering has been building toward. And the show will not give it to her because giving it to her means the show that depends on Lisa being 8-year-old and suffering in Springfield would have to stop. So, she stays at 8. She stays in the mismatch. She plays her saxophone in her room and argues with people who cannot hear her and waits, with the specific patience of someone who has no other option, for a future that the show will glimpse and then close the window on, episode after episode, decade after decade. Maggie, as discussed elsewhere, is protected by her silence in ways her siblings cannot be. But there is a dimension of Maggie's preservation at 1-year-old that has its own particular strangeness. A 1-year-old child is at the stage of maximum developmental plasticity. Their neurological architecture is in the process of being formed. Every experience, every stimulus, every interaction is contributing to the formation of who they will become. What happens to a child at 1-year-old leaves marks that last a lifetime. Maggie has been at 1-year-old for the show's entire run. She has been in the stage of maximum environmental influence for over 3 decades. In Springfield, breathing Springfield's air, drinking Springfield's water, being shaped, at the most formative possible moment, by a town the show has established as an environmental contamination zone. The radiation theory's most extreme implication, in the context of Maggie, is this. If the contamination affects neurological development most powerfully during the most sensitive developmental windows, and if Maggie has been permanently locked in the most sensitive developmental window, then Maggie is the most completely and continuously affected person in Springfield. Not Homer, who was already substantially formed when the show began. Not Bart and Lisa, who are further along in their development. Maggie, the baby, the one who sits silent and watches everything. The extraordinary capabilities the show repeatedly suggests Maggie possesses: the problem-solving intelligence, the strategic awareness, the capacity for caution and planning that no 1-year-old should have, may be the most direct expression, in the show's internal logic, of what the contamination does to a human mind when it is applied at exactly the right or wrong moment. The fish has 3 eyes. The baby has a genius nobody has measured yet. The plant has been running for decades. Connect the dots yourself, quietly, in the dark, before you fall asleep. Section 7. The Deaths Springfield Forgot. Springfield has an unusual relationship with its dead. Characters die here. Some of them come back, repeatedly without explanation. Some of them stay dead but are forgotten in ways that suggest they might as well have returned. Some of them stay dead in ways that alter something in the town's emotional landscape, while the show simultaneously declines to follow through on what the alteration means. The relationship between Springfield and mortality is not a simple one, and the pattern of who dies and who returns and what the deaths generate or fail to generate reveals something consistent about what Springfield is and how it maintains itself. Hans Moleman makes the pattern most visible. He is the character who embodies Springfield's relationship with death in its most concentrated form. He dies, frequently, in public, in front of witnesses, and he returns without explanation, and no one ever remarks on either event. The catalog of Moleman's canonical deaths is long and varied. He has been run over by vehicles. He has been buried alive. He has been crushed under falling objects. He has been set on fire. He has been drowned. He has been incinerated. He has been mauled by animals. He has been struck by falling scaffolding, struck by lightning, struck by projectiles of various kinds. Each death is complete and seemingly final within the episode where it occurs, and then he is alive and present in subsequent episodes as if nothing has happened. Because in Springfield, nothing has happened, because in Springfield, nothing that happens is allowed to accumulate into consequence. The most interesting thing about Moleman's deaths is not their frequency or their variety. It is the social context in which they occur. They do not happen privately, in circumstances where a lack of witnesses might explain the lack of response. They happen at community events, on main streets, in the middle of gatherings. People are present. People see them happen. And the people around Moleman, having witnessed his death, continue with whatever they were doing before the death occurred. This is the show's most compressed depiction of Springfield's collective capacity for not noticing. Not the dramatic, politically motivated not noticing of the contamination or the institutional corruption. The simple, low-stakes not noticing of a man dying in public, and the public not responding. Springfield absorbs Moleman's deaths the same way it absorbs everything else. Briefly, without processing, without consequence, and then it moves on. Moleman himself, in a canonical moment the show treats as throwaway comedy, has stated that he is 31 years old. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s. His physical appearance and his stated age are separated by what looks like 50 years of additional aging that his chronological age cannot explain. The radiation theory finds this detail especially interesting. If the contamination that flows from the plant into Springfield's environment affects different people differently, depending on their specific biological vulnerabilities and their specific patterns of exposure, then Moleman's catastrophic premature aging is what the contamination looks like at its most extreme. He is a man whose biological systems have been so fundamentally altered by exposure that he has aged at a rate that decoupled entirely from his chronological years. He looks ancient because whatever the plant has been putting into Springfield's water and air has done to his cellular biology, what decades of normal aging could not accomplish in the same time. And he keeps dying and coming back, which the theory would explain as a related effect. The same biological alterations that aged him catastrophically may also have altered his cellular resilience in ways that make fatal injury a temporary rather than permanent condition. His cells reconstitute, his systems restart. He dies and resets, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the same biological oddness that also makes the fish have 3 eyes and Homer's body heal from injuries that should be lethal and mister. Burns sustained life through a treatment protocol that no normal human biology could support. Bleeding Gums Murphy's death, in the episode Round Springfield, is the show's most carefully handled loss, and also, looking back at it from the perspective of what the show did afterward, a demonstration of the specific limits of the show's capacity to sustain the consequences of what it establishes. Murphy was Lisa's musical mentor, the jazz musician who recognized her saxophone playing as genuinely serious, who gave her a model for what it might look like to dedicate a life to music in the specific way of someone who has actually done it. His relationship with Lisa was the show's fullest early depiction of a certain kind of mentorship, not instruction, not encouragement, but genuine recognition. He heard what she was doing and understood it, and his understanding was a form of love that the people who loved her in other ways could not replicate. The episode handles his death with real gravity and real specificity. Lisa's grief is precise. It is the grief of losing the person who understood her music. In a town that does not produce many people who can understand her music, at an age when she has had very few experiences of being understood in the way he understood her. The show does not try to resolve this grief into comedy or into uplift. It lets the loss be the loss, and then it moves on. Murphy is referenced with decreasing frequency, and then essentially not at all. The specific shape of his absence in Lisa's musical development, the way her playing would carry the mark of having lost the one adult who heard it clearly, is not present in the episodes that follow. She plays her saxophone. She is still Lisa. The specific wound is absorbed and expelled, and the timeline continues without it. This is the show's pattern with its genuine losses. It handles them with real emotional care in the episodes that depict them, and then it releases them. The grief is honored in the moment and then not sustained, because sustaining it would require the show to allow the loss to permanently alter the character who experienced it. And permanently altered characters do not reset. Frank Grimes, whom we have discussed in other contexts, represents the most deliberate death in the show's history. Grimes was constructed specifically as the vehicle for a specific insight about what Springfield is, and his death was the insight enacted in real time. He is killed by his own attempt to understand Springfield's logic. He imitates Homer's reckless, oblivious disregard for safety protocol and is electrocuted for it while Homer sleeps at the funeral. The show committed to this death completely. Grimes never came back. His son appeared in a later episode, but Grimes himself remained dead, because bringing him back would have required the show to undo the thesis his death expressed. The thesis is, a man who tries to apply merit-based logic to Springfield will be destroyed by Springfield. You cannot bring the man back after making that point without the resurrection itself being a retraction of the point. What is remarkable about the Grimes death, in retrospect, is how completely its consequences were avoided by the show in subsequent episodes. The death proved something about Homer and about Springfield. That proof should have left a mark on how Homer was depicted, on how the show understood what Homer represents and what it costs to be the thing Homer is. Instead, the next episode began with Homer at baseline, unchanged, untroubled by what had happened, sleeping in his chair in Sector 7G. The town laughed at Grimes's funeral. Homer slept through it. The show moved on. Springfield absorbed the death of the man who saw it most clearly and felt nothing, because Springfield is a town specifically constituted to feel nothing about the things it ought to feel most. Maud Flanders' death, the result of a salary dispute rather than creative planning, created a different kind of challenge for the show. Ned Flanders' entire characterization was built on his marriage. His faith, his goodness, his specific way of navigating the world's consistent failure to reward either of those things, all of it was expressed through and sustained by his relationship with Maud. Removing Maud meant removing the foundation of the characterization without replacing it with anything of equal structural significance. The show's response was to continue writing Ned in approximately the same mode while filling the Maud-shaped absence with new romantic storylines and new character beats that addressed widowhood without deeply engaging with its implications for who Ned is. It is not that the show ignored Ned's grief, various episodes depicted it. It is that the grief never produced the specific transformation in Ned that losing Maud should have produced in a person for whom marriage was the organizing principle of identity. What the show could not write, and never fully attempted to write, was the version of Ned Flanders who was permanently changed by losing his wife. Not simply grieving grief can be episodic and reset compatible, but fundamentally different. A person shaped by loss in the way that real people are shaped by it. Not the same person in the same configuration minus one element, but a genuinely different configuration that emerged from the loss. Springfield cannot produce that person. Springfield produces people who absorb loss and continue. The dead of Springfield are honored and forgotten. The living continue to be who they were before the loss, adjusted for whatever the current episode requires, reset to baseline when the episode ends. This is both the show's structural necessity and its deepest honesty about what it believes. Springfield is a town where the dead do not change the living in any lasting way. Not because the living do not grieve, but because the reset that keeps Springfield going requires that grief, like everything else, be absorbed and expelled without permanent consequence. The dead are remembered. The dead do not matter. That is Springfield's most honest statement about itself, and it has been true in every episode since the first. Section 8. The Writer's Room's Greatest Mistakes. The writer's room of The Simpsons at its peak was, by any reasonable measure, one of the finest comedy writing staffs in the history of American television. The specific combination of talents assembled in the first decade, John Swartzwelder writing scripts of extraordinary joke density, George Meyer shaping the show's specific comedic voice, Al Jean and Mike Reiss maintaining the balance between comedy and emotional truth during the early showrunning years. Writers like Conan O'Brien, Jeff Martin, John Vitti, and many others contributing to a collective sensibility that was greater than any individual part produced work that has never been meaningfully surpassed in its genre. This is important context for understanding the show's failures, because the failures are not the failures of insufficient talent. The people who produced the declining later seasons were also talented. Many of them had genuine ability and excellent credentials. The failures are structural. They are the failures of a creative institution that outlived the specific conditions that generated its best work, and did not find a way to produce equivalent work under changed conditions. But within the broader structural failure, there are specific mistakes, specific episodes, specific decisions, specific failures of creative courage that illuminate the pattern with particular clarity. The most formally ambitious mistake the show made in its middle seasons was an attempt, across multiple episodes, to be meta-referential about its own decline in ways that the show's format could not fully support. The 138th episode Spectacular, which used a mock documentary format to comment on the show's history and presented alternate endings for the Burns shooting mystery, works beautifully because its meta-awareness is genuinely illuminating. It uses the show's history as creative material rather than simply pointing at itself. The run of meta-episodes produced in the middle and later seasons, episodes where characters seem to know they are in a declining show, where jokes are made about the show's own repetition and creative exhaustion, where the format itself is the subject, are less successful, and their failure is instructive. Meta-commentary on decline only works if the episode containing the commentary is better than the decline being commented on. If the commentary and the decline are at the same level of quality, the joke becomes inadvertently honest. The show is telling you it knows what it has become while demonstrating exactly what it has become. The episode Armin Tamzarian, or The Principal and the Pauper, as it is formally titled, is the writer's room's most discussed mistake, and the terms of the discussion tell you something about what the show's audience valued. The episode is widely cited as a betrayal of Skinner's characterization, a retroactive rewriting of a character's identity that destabilized everything previously established about him. The criticism is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses the more fundamental mistake. The fundamental mistake is not the revelation itself. That Skinner is an imposter is a dramatic idea with genuine potential. The mistake is what the show does with the revelation. Having constructed a situation with real dramatic content, a man's stolen identity exposed, a war veteran returned to find his life occupied by a stranger, a community forced to choose between the life they built on a lie and the truth that displaces it. The show resolves it by having the community vote to ignore the truth and exile the man who brought it. The resolution is funny. It is a good joke about collective denial and institutional truth suppression, but it is a joke in place of the genuine reckoning the premise required. The writer's room chose the joke over the story, which was a choice the show made increasingly often as the seasons accumulated. This pattern, choosing the joke over the story, choosing the comfortable resolution over the consequential one, choosing the laugh over the revelation, is the writer's room's most consistent and most damaging mistake across the middle and later seasons. Not in any single episode, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated weight of the choice made over and over in the direction of what was immediately funny rather than what was ultimately true. The early show made this choice differently. The episode Homer's Enemy chooses the story over the comfortable resolution. It lets Frank Grimes die. It does not redeem Homer. It does not give the audience the satisfaction of a lesson learned or a wrong righted. It ends with Homer asleep at the funeral and the crowd laughing, and it trusts the audience to feel the specific discomfort that ending produces, rather than resolving the discomfort into something easier. That trust, the early show's willingness to leave the audience in a difficult place and trust them to sit with it, was progressively lost as the show ran longer. The later show is more anxious about whether the audience is comfortable. It resolves its difficult situations more quickly into comedy. It retreats from the edge of genuine darkness more consistently. The The result is a show that is reliably funny and rarely disturbing, which is the opposite of what the early show was. Often funny and occasionally genuinely disturbing, in ways that the comedy made bearable. There is one category of mistake that is subtler than any of the ones described above, and in some ways more consequential. It is the mistake of writing characters for what they represent rather than for who they are. Every character in The Simpsons has a specific voice, a specific way of using language, specific verbal patterns and registers and habits that belong to that character and not to any other. Homer's voice is not Marge's voice. Bart's voice is not Lisa's voice. In the show's early seasons, these distinctions were sharp and consistent. You could tell from a single line of dialogue, without any visual context, exactly which character was speaking. The voices were different from each other in ways that reflected the specific psychology and history of each character. In later seasons, these distinctions became less sharp. Characters would speak in ways that fit the joke being made rather than the voice of the person making it. Homer would articulate himself in ways that belonged to someone more coherent than Homer is. Lisa would express herself in ways that were technically consistent with her intelligence, but tonally wrong for her specific emotional situation in the moment. The characters were being used as vehicles for jokes rather than as people generating jokes from their specific internal positions. A character without a consistent voice is a character whose identity has been replaced by a set of attributes. The attributes can be reproduced reliably. The voice, the specific, irreducible, could only come from this person's voice, cannot be reproduced once it is lost. It has to be understood. It has to be inhabited. And inhabiting it requires a depth of understanding of the character that the early writer's room had and that the later writer's room, through the entirely understandable processes of turnover and institutional drift, progressively lost. The show's greatest collective mistake, in the end, is the decision to keep making episodes after the creative vision that generated the show's best work was no longer fully operative. Not through incompetence, not through malice, but through the entirely ordinary commercial logic that says, if it is still profitable to make the show, make the show. The show's first 100 or so episodes constitute one of the most concentrated achievements in American television comedy. The several hundred episodes that followed constitute a record of what happens when a creative institution outlives its formative vision while remaining formally committed to producing work in its name. Both records are part of the archive. Both constitute what The Simpsons is. And the distance between them is the measure of what the show was at its best, which is to say, the measure of how much was possible, briefly, before it became what it became instead. Section 9. The guest stars who broke Springfield's reality. The Simpsons has had more celebrity guest appearances than any other scripted television show in history. This is not approximate. It is documented. The show's guest star list, if printed in full, would run longer than the script for most individual episodes. Celebrities from every field of public life entertainment, sports, politics, business, science, literature, music have appeared in Springfield across the show's 36-year run at a rate that increased consistently through the middle seasons until a celebrity appearance became simply a standard feature of each episode rather than a notable occasion. This was not always the case, and understanding what changed when celebrity appearances became routine requires starting with what they were before they became routine. The Michael Jackson appearance in the Season 3 episode Stark Raving Dad is the canonical example of how the early show used celebrity presence with genuine creative intelligence. Jackson was not credited under his real name. He voiced a character named Leon Kompowski, a large white man in a psychiatric facility who claims to be Michael Jackson and speaks with what is unmistakably Michael Jackson's voice and cadence. The episode never confirms within its narrative whether this character is who he says he is. The ambiguity is the point. The episode uses the presence of what may or may not be Michael Jackson to engage with real questions about fame, about celebrity projection, about what we do with the cultural weight of a famous person's image. It is interested in the gap between the real person and the cultural construction, in what it means to believe someone is famous and what that belief says about the believer. Lisa hears this man's voice and immediately trusts him because she has been culturally primed to. The episode is honest about this. This is what a celebrity appearance looks like when it is integral to the episode's meaning rather than grafted onto it. The celebrity is not a guest who adds glamour to a story that would function without them. The celebrity, or more precisely, The cultural fact of the celebrity's existence is what the story is about. By the show's middle seasons, celebrity appearances were generating a different relationship with the material. The appearances were real and the celebrities were playing versions of themselves, but the episodes were not particularly interested in using the celebrity's cultural significance as subject matter. They were interested in putting a famous face in Springfield and generating the specific kind of audience pleasure that comes from seeing a real famous person interact with cartoon characters. That pleasure is real. It produces laughter and a certain kind of warmth. But it is different from the pleasure the early appearances produced. It is the pleasure of recognition rather than the pleasure of illumination. By the later seasons, the celebrity appearance had become something closer to a commercial exchange. The show provided the celebrity with a cultural platform, and a certain kind of prestige credential appearing on The Simpsons remained, through the show's decline, a marker of a particular kind of cultural standing. The celebrity provided the episode with a recognizable face and the guaranteed audience attention that the recognition would produce. Both parties benefited. The episode did not necessarily benefit as a piece of storytelling. There is also the specific problem that the accumulation of celebrity appearances created for Homer's biography. By the show's later seasons, Homer Simpson has met an extraordinary number of famous people. He has been to space with real astronauts. He has encountered presidents. He has befriended musicians and actors and athletes and scientists and politicians from across the spectrum of public life. His biography, taken as a whole, would make him one of the most famous and well-connected private citizens in American history. And none of it has left a trace on who he is. This is the celebrity episode's contribution to the show's longest structural problem. Each appearance, taken individually, is an episode. Accumulated over hundreds of episodes, they create a Homer Simpson whose experiential biography is a tissue of extraordinary encounters that have changed him in no discoverable way. He is not famous. He is not well connected. He does not have opinions that reflect the extraordinary range of people he has met. He is, after every encounter, exactly the man he was before. The encounter was an episode, and the episode ended, and Homer reset. This means eventually that Homer's biography is not really a biography. It is a list of episodes. Things happened to him. The things did not constitute a life in the sense that a life involves change and accumulation and development. They were events in a cycling system. The cycle does not remember them. Neither, in any functional sense, does Homer. The guest stars were instruments of the reset's acceleration. Each one arrived, generated their specific category of audience response, and departed, leaving Homer and Springfield exactly as they found it. The town that cannot remember its catastrophes cannot remember its celebrities either. Both are absorbed and expelled. Both leave no trace. Springfield moves on. Section 10. The show's relationship with its own endings. The Simpsons has never ended. This simple fact conceals what is actually quite complex about the show's relationship with finality. Not just the finality of the show itself, but the finality of individual episodes, of story arcs, of character developments, of emotional resolutions. The show's entire structural logic is organized around the avoidance of endings that actually end things, the avoidance of conclusions in the sense of resolutions that permanently change the conditions they resolve. The episodic reset is the most visible mechanism of this avoidance, and we have discussed it throughout this video. But there are other, subtler mechanisms through which the show manages its relationship with endings, and those mechanisms are worth examining carefully, because they reveal something about what the show understands itself to be doing. The marriage crisis structure is one of the most repeated story formats in the show's entire run. In this structure, Homer and Marge's relationship reaches a crisis point. Homer's incompetence has done something that damages their connection, or Marge's patience has been exhausted beyond its usual generous limits, or some external circumstance has put pressure on the marriage in ways that the show treats as genuinely serious. The crisis develops. The couple is separated, or on the verge of separation, and then they reconcile. The marriage survives. They return to the baseline configuration. The show has used this structure dozens of times across its run. The specific crises vary. The resolution is always the same, and the repetition of the resolution Homer and Marge, together, the marriage intact, love reaffirmed, generates a specific kind of cumulative effect that the show has never fully reckoned with. The first time you watch a Homer and Marge crisis resolve into reconciliation, the resolution feels meaningful. You have watched them come close to losing each other. You have felt the specific weight of what a breakup would mean. And the reconciliation carries the emotional release of that accumulated weight. It means something. The 15th time you watch a Homer and Marge crisis resolve into reconciliation, the resolution feels predetermined. You know the pattern. You know the outcome before the crisis has fully developed. The crisis generates no real stakes because the resolution is certain. The ending is not really an ending. It is a pause. This is the show's deepest formal problem. Stated plainly, it cannot produce endings that actually end things because its structural commitment to continuity requires that nothing be permanently resolved. The things that could generate real dramatic stakes, the permanent consequences of Homer's failures, the real resolution of Marge's accumulated frustration, the actual development of the children into adults are all kept permanently available as dramatic material by being permanently prevented from resolution. Homer and Marge's marriage cannot really be in danger because the show cannot survive without it. The children cannot grow up because the show needs them to be children. The town cannot change in fundamental ways because the show's basic premise is that the town is what it is and will continue to be what it is. The potential for change is always present and always withdrawn. The ending is always almost here and always just out of reach. The Homer's coma theory's most formal reading is not about a specific plot event. It is about the show's operating logic. If everything is being dreamed by a mind that cannot update its dream with genuine consequences, then the avoidance of endings is not a production choice. It is the structural reality of the form. A dream does not conclude. It cycles. It resets. It generates experience without generating forward movement. Everything that happens in a dream is available to happen again in the next dream, with the same cast, in the same setting, at the same ages. The show about a family in a cycling, resetting town has the operating logic of a dream because the show is, in some sense, that the coma theory makes explicit and other framings make implicit a dream. It is a story that is being dreamed by someone, somewhere, who needs it to continue because the continuation is the point. Not the resolution, not the ending, the cycling itself, the couch gag that varies and the family that doesn't. The Springfield that is always exactly as you left it. The show will end someday. Probably not through a narrative conclusion, through an institutional one. It will stop being made, at some point, for reasons that have nothing to do with the story reaching its natural conclusion, because the story has no natural conclusion. It will stop because the cycling is no longer commercially viable, or because the last original voice cast member retires, or because some other circumstance beyond the story's control intervenes. When it stops, it will not have ended. It will simply have stopped. And Springfield will be frozen in its last episode's configuration, exactly as it has always been frozen, in the moment just before the ending that never came. That is the most honest thing The Simpsons has to say about endings. Not that they are impossible, that they are perpetually deferred, that the show keeps generating the conditions for an ending, the reconciliation, the resolution, the moment of genuine change, and then withdrawing those conditions before they can become permanent. Because the show knows, somewhere in whatever constitutes its institutional self-awareness, that an ending would mean admitting that it was once something and is now over. That the first 8 years were extraordinary and the subsequent years were what they were, and the whole thing, taken together, was a specific and finite achievement of American television culture, rather than an ongoing and inexhaustible fact of American life. The Simpsons is not ready to be finite. It may never be. Springfield will be there next Sunday at 8, and the couch gag will run, and the family will sit down, and the episode will begin, cycling forward from wherever the last one left off, carrying nothing from the past and promising nothing for the future, just the family, just the town, just the yellow light and the familiar faces and the cracked towers on the horizon. That is the ending the show has been building toward for 36 years. The ending that is always beginning. Section 11. Homer's jobs and the life he didn't choose. Homer Simpson has held more jobs than any other character in American television history. This is not a contested claim. The specific number depends on how you count, whether you include one-episode ventures, whether you count positions held only briefly or in dream sequences, whether the more surreal occupations of later seasons qualify as genuine employment. Conservative counts put the number in the hundreds. Generous counts approach 400 distinct occupations. He has been a food critic, a monorail conductor, a professional boxer, a country music manager, a bodyguard, a voice actor, a snowplow driver, a safety consultant, a mascot, an astronaut, a movie producer, a beer baron, a stuntman, a motivational speaker, a fisherman, a sanitation commissioner, a grill cook, a mafia associate, a rock band manager, a substitute teacher, a sea captain, a fitness instructor, a missionary, a fashion designer, a union organizer, a entrepreneur of various kinds, most of them ill-fated. He returns from every one of these jobs to Sector 7G, to the same chair, the same coffee mug, the same reactor console, the same ancient employer who cannot reliably remember his name. The plant is the thing he always comes back to, regardless of how far he strays, regardless of what he briefly becomes in the course of an episode. The plant is his gravitational center. Everything else is orbit. The standard interpretation of this pattern is purely comedic. Each new job is a new playground for Homer's specific combination of enthusiasm and incompetence, a fresh set of circumstances in which his character traits can generate comedy without the show being constrained to a single professional setting. The job itself doesn't matter. What matters is Homer in a new context, producing Homer-shaped chaos. This interpretation is correct as far as it goes. But the accumulation of hundreds of jobs across 36 years generates a picture that is more interesting than any single episode's comedy suggests. Because Homer is not simply a man who keeps failing at jobs. He is a man whose range of potential occupations is genuinely wide. The hundreds of jobs he has tried are evidence of a fundamental flexibility of capability, a basic human adaptability that expresses itself in being briefly functional across a startling variety of roles, and whose permanent occupation is the one his life's specific history made most available, rather than the one that uses what he actually has. Homer's failures at jobs follow a specific pattern. They are rarely failures of initial competence. He learns things quickly. He has physical capabilities, practical intelligence, and a specific kind of social ease with strangers that makes him effective in new environments. His failures happen downstream of his competence, not in the learning, but in the sustaining. He cannot defer gratification long enough to consolidate success. He cannot resist the immediate temptation that is directly in the path of the longer-term goal. He makes the wrong choice at the pivotal moment, the moment when the right choice would have required him to suppress an impulse that his character formed by the specific history of his life, his childhood, his environment has never been trained to suppress. This is a portrait of wasted potential that is more precise than the show usually gets credit for. Homer is not stupid in a generic way, whatever his stated IQ might suggest. He is specifically unable to translate capability into sustained achievement, and the specific nature of this inability is traceable to traceable causes. The show has established, across dozens of episodes, that Homer's psychological development was shaped by a childhood marked by maternal absence, paternal emotional distance, environmental contamination, and the specific cognitive effects of a foreign object lodged in his brain since childhood. These are not cartoon exaggerations of ordinary childhood difficulty. They are, within the show's own established terms, genuine developmental injuries. A child who loses his mother without explanation develops specific patterns of attachment and abandonment anxiety that express themselves in adulthood as a desperate need for approval and a terror of challenging the authority figures who provide it. A child raised in an environment with compromised air and water quality and neurological effects from chronic exposure develops specific cognitive limitations that are not the same as simple low intelligence. A child with a crayon in his brain since the age of 6 has been cognitively constrained by physical damage since before he was old enough to be aware of the constraint. These things together produce the specific shape of Homer's failure. He has the raw capability for many things. He lacks the specific combination of executive function, impulse control, and self-efficacy that would allow that capability to become sustained achievement. And he lacks these things not randomly, but because of specific experiences and exposures and injuries that the show has documented across its run. The plant is the job that accommodates all of this. The deal that Grandpa Simpson struck with Burns' employment security for Homer in exchange for Grandpa's silence about Burns' crimes ensures that Homer's failures at the plant do not result in termination. He can fail 742 times by the show's own count and remain employed. The plant accepts Homer in a way that no other employer can because no other employer is contractually obligated to keep him. This means that Homer's permanent occupation is not the product of his capabilities finding their best expression. It is the product of a specific historical arrangement between his father and his employer, an arrangement made when Homer was a child, without Homer's knowledge about Homer's future, in exchange for something that served Burns' interests rather than Homer's. Homer's entire adult working life has been shaped by a deal he never knew about, between two people who were not primarily acting in his interests when they made it. He goes to work at the plant every day because his grandfather made a deal. The deal keeps him employed. His employment keeps the plant's violations intact. The violations keep the contamination running. The contamination keeps Springfield's population too cognitively compromised to ask the questions that would expose everything. Burns' interests run through Homer's employment all the way down to the water that flows from the plant into Springfield's taps. The deal between Grandpa Simpson and Mr. Burns is not just about Homer's job security. It is the specific mechanism by which one man's personal history became the instrument of an entire community's ongoing damage. Homer has had hundreds of jobs. He has kept only one, and the one he kept is the one that was never really his to choose. Section 12. The specific cruelty of being Lisa Simpson. Of all the things the show has done to its characters across 36 years, what it has done to Lisa Simpson is the thing that bears the closest examination. Not because it is the most dramatic or the most obvious, but because it is the most sustained, the most consistent, and beneath the comedy, the most honest about the specific kind of damage that Springfield inflicts on its most aware resident. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old since 1989. She will be 8 years old for as long as the show continues, which based on current trajectories means she may be 8 years old for longer than most of the people reading this transcript will be alive. She will never turn 9. She will never start high school. She will never discover whether the world outside Springfield has more room for someone like her than the world inside it does. That is a specific kind of sentence. And the show has been remarkably honest about what it means to serve that sentence. Lisa's intelligence is established early and definitively, and the show never wavers from it. She is the smartest person in her family. She is the smartest student in her school, and the school is not a population of people who make that distinction difficult to maintain. By various measures and in various episode contexts, her intelligence is described as extraordinary, significantly beyond what is common even in populations of high-performing students, the kind of intelligence that standardized testing cannot adequately capture because it exceeds the ceiling the tests were designed to measure. And what does this intelligence get her? The show is honest about the answer, more honest than most shows about precocious children manage to be. It gets her isolation. It gets her the specific loneliness of being the person in the room who sees most clearly when everyone around her has a strong preference for less clear seeing. It gets her the particular exhaustion of caring deeply about things that the people she loves are not equipped to care about in the same way. It gets her the daily friction of having a mind calibrated for a world larger than the one she is permitted to inhabit. The show depicts this suffering with a consistency and a care that honors the reality of the experience. It does not romanticize it. It does not present Lisa's intelligence as a triumphant gift that makes her suffering worth it. It presents it as an actual burden that makes her actual life genuinely harder than it would be if she were less capable of seeing what she sees. This is rarer in fiction about intelligent children than it should be. The standard narrative of the gifted child in fiction treats the child's intelligence as a treasure whose difficulty is temporary. The brilliant child is misunderstood now, but will be recognized eventually, and the recognition will make the misunderstanding retroactively worthwhile. The show does not use this narrative. It uses the one where the brilliant child is misunderstood, the misunderstanding is ongoing, and the recognition arrives occasionally and partially and is always withdrawn before it can become permanent. Lisa's relationship with music is the show's most sustained exploration of what art means to someone in her specific situation. The saxophone is not just an instrument. It is the form in which she can express the things she cannot say in the language that Springfield speaks, the language of commerce and complaint and willful not noticing. In music, she is not explaining herself to people who cannot follow the explanation. She is simply being what she is, in a form that doesn't require the listener to understand in order to receive something true. When Bleeding Gums Murphy recognized her playing, it was the show depicting the specific and rare experience of being genuinely heard by someone with the capacity to actually hear you. Not encouraged. Encouragement is something parents and teachers provide, regardless of merit. Recognized. Heard by someone who understood the specific quality of what she was doing, and confirmed, through their understanding, that the quality was real. His death took that away, and the show handled the loss with real emotional precision in the episode that depicted it. But the specific shape of what his death meant for Lisa's development, the way losing the one adult who understood her music would mark her relationship with music going forward, was not carried into the episodes that followed. She plays. She is good. The specific texture of the loss is absorbed and expelled. The timeline continues. Lisa's romantic life, in the episodes that address it, tends toward the same pattern of brief recognition and withdrawal. The substitute teacher who engaged her intellectually, who treated her questions as worthy of real answers rather than as the precocious behavior of a child to be managed, generated a specific attachment that the show depicted, with genuine emotional accuracy. She fell not for his authority or his appearance, but for the experience of being intellectually matched, of having a conversation that could go anywhere because both parties were capable of following it anywhere. When he left, the loss was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was the loss of the rarest kind of company. The show understands this and depicts it honestly. And then it lets it go, as it lets everything go, and Lisa is back at baseline, 8 years old, in 3rd grade, alone in her intelligence, playing her saxophone in her room. There is a particular episode in the show's 3rd season, It's Affair to Remember, would be too obvious, but the episode where Lisa has a full breakdown from the accumulated weight of her situation, where the show depicts what happens when the specific suffering of being Lisa Simpson in Springfield reaches a point that requires acknowledgement. She collapses under the weight of it. A therapist is involved. The show is honest that the cause is not a single event, but the structural reality of her life. The therapist gives her a stuffed animal named Julio. It temporarily helps. The structural reality of her life does not change. The next episode begins. This is the show being most honest about what it is doing to Lisa. Not through drama or through tragedy, but through the patient, episode-by-episode depiction of what it costs to be the most perceptive person in a willfully imperceptive town, at an age when perception is the one thing you have and the one thing the town is constructed to defeat. Lisa Simpson deserves to grow up. She deserves to leave Springfield and find the world that has room for her. She has earned it across 36 years of careful, specific, sustained depiction of what it means to be her. The show knows this. It has imagined her future, glimpsed it through the window of Lisa's wedding, seen the young woman she becomes when time is finally allowed to pass, and it closes the window. It keeps her at 8. It keeps her in the mismatch, because her suffering is the material from which the show makes some of its most precise and honest comedy, and the show is not willing to let the material go. That is the specific cruelty of being Lisa Simpson. She is the show's most valuable asset and its most neglected character simultaneously. She is used most fully and given least in return. She is seen most clearly and changed least as a result of being seen. She keeps playing. That is the thing the show has gotten exactly right about her, for 36 years without exception. She keeps playing her saxophone in her room. The town doesn't hear it the way it should be heard. She plays it anyway. That specific stubbornness, the willingness to continue doing the thing that needs to be done regardless of whether anyone is adequately receiving it, is the most accurate and most moving thing the show has ever said about what it means to be alive and aware in a world that is often neither. Section 13. The town that runs on forgetting. Everything we have discussed tonight, the yellow skin, the continuity graveyard, the secondary characters simplified into types, the marriage origin stories revised to fit the floating timeline, the economy that never quite adds up, the children preserved at ages that protect them from futures the show has glimpsed and refused to deliver, The deaths absorbed without consequence, the writer's room that gradually chose the reliable over the revelatory, the guest stars who left no marks on Homer's biography, the endings that cycle back to beginnings, all of these threads lead to the same place. Springfield runs on forgetting. Not casually or accidentally, structurally. The town's social fabric, its economic relationships, its political arrangements, its family dynamics, everything about how Springfield functions as a community depends on a systematic and collective capacity to not hold on to things, to experience something and let it go, to have something catastrophic happen and allow the next episode to begin without the catastrophe having left a mark. This is not incidental to Springfield's character. It is Springfield's character. The town is what it is because its residents cannot accumulate experience into the kind of ongoing wisdom that would require them to act differently. They encounter things. The things do not alter them. They reset. The radiation theory says this is because the contamination has damaged the neurological systems responsible for memory consolidation and critical evaluation. The coma theory says this is because everything is happening inside the mind of a dreaming man whose dream cannot update itself with genuine consequence. The collective denial theory says this is because the town has constructed social mechanisms specifically designed to prevent acknowledgement of anything that would require change. All of these theories are descriptions of the same fundamental reality from different angles. Springfield is a place where experience does not become wisdom, where catastrophe generates brief attention and then reset, where the same mistakes can be made with the same enthusiasm episode after episode because the last episode's consequences have been quietly dissolved. And this is deeply true, not as parody, not as caricature, but as accurate observation of many real communities. The capacity for collective amnesia, the ability of a group of people to agree, tacitly or explicitly, not to hold on to things that would require them to act differently, is one of the most fundamental features of social life. Communities survive partly by forgetting. By absorbing damage without requiring that every piece of absorbed damage be fully accounted for and addressed. By maintaining the fiction of continuity and stability even when the underlying reality is disruption and ongoing harm. Springfield just does this more completely and more honestly than most places. It does not pretend to remember. It does not maintain archives of its past catastrophes or hold ceremonies to honor lessons learned from disasters. It does not tell its children about the time the dome came down or the ongoing questions about the river fish. Springfield's forgetting is comprehensive and unapologetic. And the show depicts this as both comedy and darkness, holding both registers simultaneously. The comedy is in the absurdity of a town that resets after every disaster, the slapstick rhythm of consequence-free existence. The darkness is in what that comedy costs the price paid by the people who live in a town whose primary survival skill is its inability to learn. What cannot be learned cannot be fixed. A community that forgets its contamination cannot remediate it. A family that cycles through the same conflicts without accumulating the kind of understanding that would produce different behavior cannot grow. A person whose brain resets between each attempt at change cannot build the forward momentum that change requires. Springfield is the place where everything is always available to be tried, and nothing can be permanently achieved, because permanent achievement requires the kind of sustained forward motion that the town's fundamental nature prevents. The show's warmth is inseparable from this darkness. The Simpsons is not a dark show, it is warm, it is funny, it has genuine affection for every member of the family it depicts, and genuine love for the town that contains them. But the warmth is warm in the specific way that a very familiar place is warm, comfortable, known, slightly too small, impossible to leave. The family stays together because they love each other and also because Springfield doesn't let anything go. The warmth and the trap are the same thing. This is what makes the show genuinely true, underneath the jokes and the inconsistencies and the 36 years of accumulated drift away from its own best qualities. It found a form that could hold the warmth and the trap simultaneously. A family that is genuinely loving and genuinely constrained. A town that is genuinely communal and genuinely incapable of the kind of change that would make the community better. A show that is genuinely funny about the specific human incapacities that prevent Springfield from becoming anything other than what it is. That form ran for 36 years. In its best years, it was the most precise and the most humane and the most honest comedy on American television. In its later years, It was the echo of what it had been, cycling through its established configurations with enough residual craft to remain watchable and enough accumulated distance from its own best qualities to feel, to anyone who knew what it had once been, like a quiet, ongoing loss. But the best years are there. They are in the archive. They are available. Homer and Marge are on the couch, young and specific and fully themselves, in a Springfield that is strange and dark and warm and wrong in all of its most interesting ways. The fish has 3 eyes. The cooling towers leak. The safety inspector is asleep in his chair. The children are preserved at their perfect ages in amber that also happens to be radioactive. The town keeps forgetting. The show keeps cycling. And somewhere in a hospital bed in Springfield General, if the theory is true, a man named Homer Simpson is sleeping and dreaming of his family, exactly as they were on the day the vending machine fell, preserved in the specific warmth of a dream that will not let them go. Rest now. Springfield is exactly as you left it. It always is. That's the whole point. Section 14. Moe's Tavern and the loneliness that never gets addressed. There is a place in Springfield that the show has used more consistently than almost any other location outside the Simpson home. It is Moe's Tavern, the neighborhood bar on the corner of Walnut Street and wherever it is, and it has been there since the beginning, since the first episode, since Homer was already a regular, since Moe Zislak was already behind the bar with that specific expression of permanent low-grade misery that would define him across every subsequent appearance. The tavern is a functional location for comedy. It generates reliable material. It provides a setting in which Homer can drink too much and say things he shouldn't, and have conversations with a rotating cast of supporting characters that the domestic setting of the Simpson home doesn't easily accommodate. Moe's is where the show goes when it needs Homer in a context that is not his workplace and not his family, the third space. The place where he is neither employee nor husband and father, where he is simply a man sitting at a bar with a drink. But the tavern is also more than a functional location. In the early seasons especially, the show used Moe's as a setting for a kind of character study that it rarely replicated elsewhere. The study of what it looks like to build a life around a single institution that serves as substitute for all the things the institution cannot actually provide. Moe Zislak is the character the show has been cruelest to for the longest. Not in dramatic, story-driven ways, the show is not continuously focused on Moe's suffering in the way that it is continuously focused on, say, Lisa's or Ned's. But across dozens of episodes spanning the entire run of the show has established a picture of Moe that is, taken whole, one of the bleakest portraits of loneliness in American television comedy. The picture is this: Moe owns a bar. The bar is failing in the low-grade, persistent way of a bar that has never quite failed but has also never been profitable, that operates in the red end of marginal viability, that exists because Moe has nowhere else to go, and because the regulars who drink there have nowhere else to go, and because the mutual dependency of the bar owner and the bar regulars constitutes a kind of community that is not quite friendship and not quite family, but that serves some of the functions of both in the absence of either. Moe's romantic history, or rather, his near-complete lack of romantic history, has been addressed in various episodes with a specificity that makes it genuinely painful. He is not simply unlucky in love in the way of a standard sitcom character whose romantic failures are comic rather than real. He is someone whose specific combination of appearance and manner and the particular quality of his self-presentation creates consistent romantic failure in ways that he has internalized into a fairly settled expectation that connection of this kind is not available to him. There are exceptions. The show has produced episodes where Moe briefly achieves a romantic connection, where someone sees him and responds to him, and he experiences, temporarily, the specific kind of warmth that comes from being wanted by someone. These episodes are handled with a tenderness that sits oddly against the show's general comic register, because the tenderness is genuine. The show cares about Moe in these moments in a way that makes the inevitable failure of each connection, the return to the bar and the baseline, and the specific expression of permanent misery feel like a real loss rather than a comic reset. The show has also explored Moe's suicidal ideation with a casualness that is either the most honest thing it has ever done about mental health in a comedy context or the most irresponsible, depending on your perspective. Moe's relationship with the phone in the early seasons, the gag structure of Bart calling and asking for fictional people whose names form crude puns, and Moe falling for it every time contains, underneath its surface comedy, a character who is deeply isolated and whose daily life involves the repeated experience of being the butt of a joke he cannot see coming. He is fooled. He is humiliated. He reacts with rage. And he keeps answering the phone. He keeps answering the phone because the call, even a prank call, is contact. It is someone engaging with him. Even the humiliation of the prank is preferable to the alternative, which is the bar with no one calling, and the regulars sitting in silence, and Moe behind the counter with his expression of permanent low-grade misery, and no one paying attention to what that expression means. The tavern itself has been the site of various failed entrepreneurial attempts over the show's run. Moe has tried to rebrand it, to upgrade it, to transform it from a dive bar into something more aspirational, a cocktail lounge, a family restaurant, a trendy establishment. Each attempt fails. The bar reverts to its baseline configuration: sticky countertop, dim lighting, limited menu, same regulars in the same seats. The reversion is both comedy and diagnosis. The bar is what it is because Moe is who he is, and Moe is who he is because the bar is what it is. They are mutually constitutive. The attempts to change the bar are attempts to change himself, and they fail for the same reason those attempts usually fail. The conditions that produce the current state are still operating. The bar is a dive because the combination of Moe's specific capabilities and limitations and the specific market he operates in produces a dive. Rebranding does not change those conditions. The conditions reassert themselves. This is, in miniature, the same story Springfield tells about itself at the macro level. The town is what it is because the conditions that produced it are still operating. The contamination, the captured economy, the institutional failures, these are not branding problems that can be solved by a new sign on the front of the building. They are structural. They reassert themselves. The town reverts to baseline. Moe's Tavern is Springfield in miniature, a place that is what it is because the forces that made it that way are still running. A place whose attempts at transformation consistently fail because transformation requires changing the conditions, not just the surface. A place that has been exactly itself for 36 years and will continue to be exactly itself for as long as the show runs. Because the show needs it to be exactly itself, the same sticky countertop and dim lighting, and specific expression of misery behind the bar that tells you, every time you see it, that some places in the world are exactly what they look like and have never been anything else and will never be anything else, and this is one of them. Rest here for a moment. It is very quiet at this hour in Moe's Tavern. The lights are low. The regulars have gone home, or gone somewhere. Moe is behind the bar. He has that expression. He always has that expression. Section 15. Everything the show knew and never said. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We have walked through the yellow streets and examined the contaminated water and cataloged the dead and traced the specific forms of damage done to each member of the family that lives in the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace. We have followed the threads of Homer's revised childhood and Marge's eroded complexity, and Bart's perpetually deferred development, and Lisa's sustained and carefully observed suffering. We have sat with the secondary characters who were once specific people and became types. We have looked at the economy that never quite makes sense and the deaths that never quite leave marks and the marriages that cycle through crisis and reconciliation without the cycle ever producing genuine change. What all of these threads have in common is that they lead, eventually, to the same place. The Simpsons is a show about things it cannot bring itself to say directly. It knows that Springfield is a contamination zone whose residents have been physically and neurologically altered by the industrial facility that powers their town. It knows this, and it shows you the yellow skin and the three-eyed fish, and Burns's glowing body and Homer's specific cognitive limitations, and it trusts you to connect the dots while declining to connect them itself. It knows that the family it has been depicting for 36 years is a family in which the children are not growing up, in which the parents are not aging, in which the future is permanently available as a subject of imagination and permanently unavailable as a subject of experience. It knows this constitutes a specific kind of tragedy about time and what we do with it and what it costs to not be allowed to move through it. And it keeps deferring the tragedy through the comedy of the reset. It knows that the town runs on forgetting and that the forgetting is not a bug, but a feature that Springfield's collective amnesia is not a failure of the community's functioning, but the mechanism by which the community functions. That the reset is the social contract. That the agreement to forget is the agreement that makes Springfield possible, and that making Springfield possible is the thing that keeps the plant running, and burns in power, and the water contaminated, and the fish three-eyed, and the residents yellow. It knows all of this. It has known it since the early seasons, when the writers were at their most precise and most honest and most willing to follow their own implications to their uncomfortable conclusions. And it has declined, across its entire run, to say it directly, to connect the dots out loud, to draw the line from the yellow skin to the plant, to Burns, to the deal with Grandpa Simpson, to Homer's specific cognitive profile, to the specific shape of his failures at every job that was not the one his family's suffering. Subsidized. The show tells you everything by showing you everything and connecting nothing. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a choice. The choice to remain a comedy rather than becoming the diagnosis that its own material implies. The choice to keep Springfield warm and functional and funny rather than letting the full weight of what the show knows about it land on the audience and change what the experience of watching it is. That choice has costs, as we have documented at length. The show's failure to follow its own implications has produced a 36-year pattern of gestures toward depth that never arrive at depth, of emotional honesty that stops just short of the most honest thing, of comedy that is always aware of the darkness underneath it, and always declining to look at that darkness directly. But the choice has produced something as well. It has produced a show that has been genuinely loved by multiple generations of viewers in the specific way that things are loved when they feel like home known so thoroughly that the knowing itself becomes the pleasure, comfortable enough that the comfort becomes the point, warm enough that the warmth makes everything else survivable. Springfield is wrong in all the ways we have discussed tonight. It is contaminated and captured and amnesiac and constitutionally incapable of the kind of change that would make it better. Its residents are damaged in specific and systematic ways that the show depicts and declines to diagnose. Its children are frozen at ages that protect them from futures the show has seen and refuses to deliver. Its secondary characters have been simplified from specific people into reliable types. Its economy does not add up. Its dead do not change it. Its marriages cycle and its timeline floats, and its history revises itself every few seasons to fit the arithmetic of perpetual youth. All of this is true, and the family is still on the couch. Homer still loves Marge in the specific, unequivocal way he has always loved her. Lisa still plays her saxophone in her room with the specific stubbornness of someone who knows the value of what she is doing, regardless of whether anyone is adequately receiving it. Bart still has the gap between what he has and what his environment allows him to do with it, and he navigates that gap with the specific practical creativity that has always been the most interesting thing about him. Maggie still watches from behind her enormous eyes, and her pacifier, silent, tracking everything, waiting. The show is wrong about many things. It is right about the most important one. A family can be imperfect and constrained and confused and fundamentally constituted around the specific and mutual forms of damage that a life together produces, and it can still be a family. The love can still be real. The couch can still be the right place to be at the end of the day. That is the thing the show has always known and has always managed to say, even when it was declining in every other way. Even when the continuity was broken and the characters were simplified and the celebrity guests had hollowed out Homer's biography and the writer's room was choosing the reliable laugh over the genuine revelation, even then, when the episode ended, the family was together. Homer had done something foolish, and Marge had been patient, and the children were safe, and the yellow light of 742 Evergreen Terrace was on. That is still true. It has been true in every episode for 36 years. It is the thing the show has gotten right in the midst of getting so many other things wrong. The thing worth protecting, whatever else is broken. The thing that makes the cycling bearable, or more than bearable, the thing that makes the cycling feel, at its best, like home. Sleep now. Let the rest of it go for tonight. Springfield will be wrong tomorrow too, in all the same ways, and we can talk about it then. The family is on the couch, the lights are on. The town is exactly as you left it. It always is. That's the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If something in here landed in Homer's specific kind of loving failure, in Lisa's specific kind of sustained and patient suffering, in the yellow light of a house that is always exactly as it was, then the show did what it was always trying to do. It showed you a version of something true and let you sit with it long enough for it to matter. The next one starts whenever you're ready. Springfield will be here. It always is. End of script. Section 16. What Burns actually is. Charles Montgomery Burns has been the richest man in Springfield for longer than most of Springfield can remember. He has been the richest man in the state, by some calculations, for longer than several of his employees have been alive. He has been alive, by the show's own internal accounting, for over a century, possibly approaching 140 years. Depending on which episode you're using and which historical memory you're treating as canonical, he has described personal involvement in events from the first decade of the 20th century, referenced working relationships with figures who died before the Second World War, attended Yale in a graduating class that would place his birth year somewhere in the 1880s. He is, within the show's established facts, the single most important figure in Springfield's history. Not important the way a beloved mayor or a famous native son is important. Important the way the ground under a building is important. Invisible, structural, the thing that makes everything else possible and that nobody looks at because looking down is not what people do when they are trying to live their lives. Burns owns the plant. The plant powers the town. The town depends on the plant. That dependency chain, running from the individual electrical outlet in every Springfield home all the way up to the boardroom of Burns's nuclear facility, is the spine of Springfield's economic and political life. Every interaction between Springfield's residents and their public institutions is shaped, at some level, by the fact that those institutions exist in the shadow of an entity that Burns controls and that Springfield cannot function without. This is what the show has established about Burns across 36 years of episodes, in accumulating detail, through dozens of storylines that approach his power from different angles without ever fully mapping its extent. And the full extent, assembled from the pieces the show has provided, is extraordinary. Burns has been shown to have influence over the town's political institutions that goes well beyond normal civic participation. He does not merely donate to political campaigns or advocate for favorable regulation. He purchases outcomes. The specific mechanism of his purchase varies by episode, sometimes cash, sometimes favors, sometimes the threat of economic retaliation through his control of the power supply, but the mechanism is always available and always effective because the town's dependency on him gives him leverage that no amount of civic virtue on the part of individual politicians can counteract. He has been shown to have influence over the town's media environment. Kent Brockman, the Channel 6 news anchor who is Springfield's primary source of local news, has in various episodes demonstrated a relationship with Burns's interests that is not the relationship of an independent journalist covering power honestly. The coverage of events at the nuclear plant, the treatment of stories that touch on Burns's activities, the specific things that do and do not become local news in Springfield, these have the shape, across dozens of episodes, of a media environment in which the most powerful economic actor has some level of influence over the coverage of stories that implicate him. He has been shown to have influence over the town's healthcare institutions. The specific nature of this influence is less explicitly depicted than his political and media influence, but it is present in the background of episodes that touch on Springfield's medical establishment. The crayon that lodged in Homer's brain as a child was not detected across years of medical examinations in Springfield. The contamination that the show implies has been affecting Springfield's population for decades has not produced the kind of systematic medical documentation that would, in an uncompromised medical community, generate public health responses. The gaps in Springfield's medical record are the shape of what it looks like when a healthcare system operates under the influence of the most powerful figure in the community. Burns has been shown to have engaged in what the show depicts as decades of environmental violation that would, in a functioning regulatory environment, have resulted in criminal prosecution, significant remediation requirements, and possibly the shutdown of his facility. none of these consequences have materialized. The regulatory apparatus, the EPA, the state government, whatever local oversight should apply to a nuclear power plant, has been either absent, ineffective, or, in the show's more explicit depictions, actively managed by Burns's influence. The 342 safety violations are not a secret. They were found in a surprise inspection. They were documented, and nothing happened. This is the picture of a person who has, over a very long life, and through the systematic application of enormous wealth, constructed a system designed to maintain his specific position in it indefinitely. Not just his wealth, his immunity, his freedom from the accountability that applies to everyone else, his ability to make decisions that cost the community he operates in, while the community has no mechanism to require him to answer for those decisions. The most interesting thing about Burns, in this context, is not his villainy. It is his competence. Burns is not simply a cartoon villain. He is, within the show's established terms, a genuinely intelligent and strategically capable operator who has been managing a complex web of dependencies, relationships, and leverage points for over a century, and who has managed it successfully enough to still be at the top of the same system he built. His relationship with Smithers, the devoted, loyal, organizationally essential assistant who manages Burns's appointments, maintains his treatment schedule, handles the 1,000 practical details of his daily operation, is one of the show's most sustained and carefully observed dynamics. And what makes it interesting, beyond the obvious layer of Smithers' personal attachment to Burns, is the specific nature of the dependency that runs in both directions. Burns depends on Smithers not simply for administrative support. He depends on Smithers for his life. The weekly radiation treatments that maintain Burns's disease equilibrium must be scheduled with precision and executed reliably, or Burns dies within a week. Smithers manages this schedule. Smithers is, in the most literal possible sense, the person whose organizational reliability stands between Burns and death. This makes Smithers something more than an assistant. He is the single individual whose absence would kill the most powerful man in Springfield within 7 days. His loyalty is not just emotional, it is structural. Burns cannot simply replace him because the replacement would not have the specific knowledge of the treatment protocol, of the precise scheduling, of the exact nature of what keeps Burns's impossible biology running that Smithers has accumulated through decades of managing it. Smithers knows more about how Burns stays alive than Burns himself does. This knowledge is Smithers' real power, and it is power he has never used in any adversarial way, and the show is interested in the specific nature of that restraint the way a person who could, technically, end the most powerful man in Springfield simply by ceasing to arrange his medical appointments, chooses not to, episode after episode, decade after decade. The answer the show implies is not simply loyalty or love, though both are present in Smithers' characterization in complicated ways. The answer is also that Smithers' identity is organized around his role in Burns's life in a way that makes exercising his real power unthinkable, because exercising it would end the relationship that constitutes his primary source of meaning, and ending that relationship would leave Smithers with nothing to be. This is, again, a real and fairly dark observation about the specific forms of dependency that structured relationships produce. Smithers has more power than Burns in the most fundamental sense, the power to end the other person's life by simply stopping doing something. And he will never use it, because the relationship that gives him that power is also the relationship that prevents him from seeing the power clearly enough to use it. Burns is kept alive by a man whose identity is built around keeping him alive. The arrangement is self-maintaining. It requires no coercion and no force. It runs on the specific human need to be necessary to someone. And Burns, who understands this, who has always understood this, who has managed human psychology for 100 years as a professional exercise, engineered it precisely because it would run on that need without requiring any additional mechanism. Burns is not just a villain. He is a systems designer. And Springfield is the system he designed. Everything in Springfield, the yellow skin and the three-eyed fish, and Homer's job security, and the town's institutional capture, and the floating timeline, and the collective amnesia, everything runs through Burns. Everything is downstream of the decisions he made over a century of systematic acquisition of the specific levers of power that a company town offers. He built the system, He maintains the system. He is maintained by the system. It is a closed loop, self-sustaining, running on the specific human incapacities for sustained resistance, for clarity about long-term systematic harm, for the kind of collective action that would be required to challenge concentrated power that the system itself generates and maintains. Springfield cannot challenge Burns because Burns has contaminated the very capacities that challenging him would require. The clarity to see the problem, the cognitive function to connect the dots, the institutional infrastructure, the police, the courts, the media, the healthcare system that would provide the mechanisms for accountability, all of it runs through Burns. All of it is shaped by him. All of it continues to operate in the specific configuration that serves his interests because that configuration is the one that has been systematically maintained for over a century. He is the oldest man in Springfield. He is kept alive by weekly radiation treatments, sustained by a fortune that predates the nation's regulatory infrastructure, managed by a devoted assistant whose identity is organized around his survival, surrounded by a population too altered by his facility's output to clearly understand what has been done to them. He will outlast all of them. He has always outlasted all of them. That is the design. Sleep on that. It is not a comfortable thought. But it is the most honest thought the show has been offering for 36 years, hiding in plain sight behind the comedy of a man who cannot remember his employee's name. Section 17. The Treehouse of Horror, and what the show does with darkness when it thinks no one is keeping score. Every year, sometime in October, The Simpsons produces an episode that it labels non-canonical. The Treehouse of Horror is an anthology format, 3 stories per episode, that allows the show to do things it cannot do in the main continuity. Kill its characters, put them in supernatural scenarios, abandon the constraints of realistic plausibility entirely, and explore kinds of darkness that the regular episode format with its requirement for reset and continuity cannot sustain. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are officially outside the show's canon. They do not count. The deaths in them do not leave the characters dead. The events in them do not alter the following week's episode. They are, in the show's own terms, safely non-real. And they are some of the most revealing things the show has ever made. Because what a creative institution does when it believes the rules do not apply reveals what it actually thinks about those rules. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show freed from the episodic reset, freed from the requirement to produce something that the following episode can ignore, and what the show does with that freedom is, if you look at it carefully, a record of everything the regular format suppresses. The early Treehouse of Horror episodes take genuine horror seriously as a register. They are genuinely frightening in ways that the regular show, with its requirement for comedy-forward storytelling, cannot be. They use the horror genre's specific vocabulary dread, the uncanny, the revelation of the thing that has been true all along, to say things about the Simpson family and about Springfield that the regular format keeps at a comic distance. The Homer being stalked and consumed by malevolent supernatural forces in the early Halloween episodes is recognizably connected to the Homer, who is being slowly destroyed by his environment in the regular episodes. The difference is that the Halloween format makes the destruction visible and immediate, while the regular format makes it gradual and deniable. In the Treehouse, you can see what is happening to Homer because the format allows it to happen at a speed and a visual explicitness that makes the horror legible. In the regular show, the same thing is happening at a pace designed to keep it below the threshold of clear recognition. The Treehouse episodes about technology, the early ones about televisions that control minds, about machines that develop sinister autonomy, about the specific ways in which the domestic objects of American middle-class life might be understood as threats rather than comforts, are the show's most explicit engagement with the anxiety that underlies its regular comedy about American domestic life. The anxiety is real. It runs through the regular show as subtext. In the Treehouse, it runs as text. There is something the Treehouse format reveals about the show's understanding of its own family that is particularly instructive. In multiple Treehouse episodes across the show's run, the horror is generated not by external supernatural threats but by the family members themselves. Homer as a monster, Bart as a reality-warping tyrant, the family as the source of the darkness rather than its target. The regular show cannot do this. The regular show requires the family to be, at some level, the safe space, the place of genuine love and genuine protection, imperfect but fundamentally oriented toward the good. The family is the thing that survives Springfield's various catastrophes. The love at the center of 742 Evergreen Terrace is what the show is protecting. The treehouse strips that protection away. In the treehouse, the family can be terrible to each other. Homer can be genuinely monstrous. Bart can be genuinely dangerous. The love can be genuinely absent or genuinely warped into something unrecognizable. And the family survives, and the episode ends, and the next treehouse episode begins with the family intact and the love restored. Because the treehouse resets too, it resets within its own non-canonical frame. But the things the treehouse depicts, the specific ways the family members can be terrible to each other when the show is not protecting them from themselves, are not entirely absent from the regular show. They are the regular show's subtext. Homer's oblivious selfishness is sometimes genuinely harmful to his family. Bart's disregard for consequences produces real damage to real people. The love at the center of the family is real, but it coexists with the specific ways each family member fails the others through their specific character traits and specific limitations. The treehouse just shows this without the softening that the regular format requires. It removes the comic distancing that makes the regular show's darkness bearable. It says, "Here is what Homer and Bart and the rest of them actually are when we are not working to protect you from the full implications of what we have built." The treehouse episodes also reveal something about the show's relationship with death that the regular format cannot. In the treehouse, death is frequent, often gruesome, sometimes comic and sometimes not, and it does not produce grief because the non-canonical frame brackets grief as unnecessary. Characters die all the time in the treehouse. Nobody mourns them. The next segment begins. This is the show's most honest statement about its relationship with mortality, made in the context where honesty is permitted. Death is everywhere in Springfield. It produces no lasting consequence. It is absorbed and expelled, and the story continues. The regular show maintains this reality in the background, visible in Mulman's repeated deaths and the abbreviated mourning periods after genuine losses. The treehouse puts it in the foreground. Bodies everywhere. Nobody changes. The story continues. There is also the specific thing the treehouse does with Burns that the regular format rarely allows. In the treehouse, Burns can be fully monstrous. Not the specific kind of corporate monstrousness that the regular show depicts, the systematic harm, the calculated indifference, the engineered dependency, but the kind of monstrousness that is immediately, visibly, unambiguously evil. He can be a vampire. He can be a creature of literal, supernatural darkness. He can be something whose nature is written on its face in ways that make the connection between his appearance and his character undeniable. The regular show cannot do this because the regular show requires Burns to be a human being, flawed, powerful, terrible in specific human ways, but human. The treehouse gives him the option of being what the regular show implies he is at his most extreme, something genuinely inhuman that has been living among humans for so long and wearing the human shape so consistently that the difference is only visible in certain lights. He is the same character. The treehouse just removes the human costume and shows you what is underneath. Section 18. The specific weight of Homer, hearing the word daddy. There is a moment that occurs in the show's 4th season that, if you know what you're looking at when you look at it, contains the most compressed emotional statement the show ever made about Homer Simpson's interior life. It occurs in an episode called Lisa's First Word, which is also the episode where Elizabeth Taylor voices Maggie saying daddy for the first and only canonical time in the show's history. The setup: Bart and Lisa are asking Homer about their earliest memories, specifically asking what word Maggie's first word was. Homer can't remember. The episode proceeds in flashback, depicting the period when the family moved to Evergreen Terrace and Bart adjusted badly to the arrival of Lisa as a new sibling. The memory structure of the episode is about sibling rivalry and the specific difficulty of no longer being the only child. But the ending reframes everything that came before. At the end of the episode, the camera returns to Maggie in her room at bedtime. The family has all gone to sleep. The house is quiet. Maggie, alone, removes her pacifier. She almost never does this and says, in a voice that belongs to someone whose cultural weight is the weight of the most famous actress of her generation, "Daddy?" Homer is asleep, he does not hear it. And this is the most precise and the most devastating thing the show has ever done with its most beloved character executed in under 10 seconds, with no music and no comedy and no acknowledgement from anyone in the episode that anything significant has just happened. Homer does not hear his daughter say "Daddy" for the first time. He is asleep. The word is spoken into the quiet of his house, and he is not there to receive it. And the episode ends. And that's it. The word was said. Homer didn't hear it. The show moves on. This is the show being honest, in the most compressed possible form, about something that runs through Homer's entire characterization. He is the person everyone in his family loves most completely, and he misses most of the demonstrations of that love. Not because he is absent or indifferent in the way of a genuinely bad father, but because his specific combination of cognitive limitation and emotional obliviousness, and the particular quality of his presence in his own life, which is often more like absence, like Homer being elsewhere even when he is physically there, running on instinct and appetite while the people around him are consciously experiencing the same moment, means that the moments that would matter most to him, if he knew about them, often happen when he is not quite there to receive them. Maggie says "Daddy" for the first time and Homer is asleep. This is who Homer is. It is not a condemnation. It is an observation, the kind of specific, precise observation that the early show made about its characters, with a consistency and a care that made it extraordinary. Homer loves his family. Homer misses significant portions of his family's experience of loving him. He is present and absent simultaneously. He would be devastated if he knew what he had missed. He will never know, because the show will not tell him, because the show is arranged so that he sleeps through his own most important moments. He sleeps through Grimes's funeral. He sleeps through Maggie saying "Daddy." He sleeps through significant portions of the life that his coma-dreaming mind is trying to preserve. The show has understood something about Homer for 36 years that it has never fully articulated. He is a man who is slightly late to his own life. Not dramatically late, not with the tragic lateness of someone who has missed everything, just slightly, consistently, persistently late, arriving at the moment after the moment, missing the specific thing by the specific margin that his specific nature makes inevitable. And he loves his family so completely and so continuously that the specific things he misses are the specific things that would tell him most clearly how much he is loved back. Maggie says "Daddy" into the quiet house. Homer is asleep. This is the whole show, in 10 seconds. Section 9:18. What Springfield looks like from outside. We have spent this entire video inside Springfield. We have examined it from the inside, using the tools the show has given us: the episodes, the established facts, the accumulated patterns of what the show says and does not say. This is the right approach for the kind of analysis we have been doing. You cannot understand what a place is like from outside it. But there is also value in pulling back, in taking the long view, in asking not what Springfield is when you are inside it, but what it looks like from the distance that 36 years of cultural history provides. The Simpsons was created in a specific moment in American history and released into a specific cultural context that shaped what it meant and how it was received. The show premiered on the 17th of December 1989. The Cold War was in its final stages. The Berlin Wall had fallen 1 month earlier. The United States was experiencing the end of a specific geopolitical era and the beginning of what the early 1990s would briefly imagine was a new kind of American hegemony. The world after the superpower competition, the potential dawn of something different. It also premiered at the end of a decade in which American economic inequality had increased significantly, in which the specific form of working-class life that Homer Simpson represented had been put under sustained pressure by deindustrialization and stagnant wages, and the gradual withdrawal of the social contract that had, in the post-war period, offered working-class Americans a reasonable expectation of stability. The Simpsons arrived in a moment when the family it depicted, a nuclear plant worker supporting a family of 5 in a suburban home on a single income, was becoming less economically plausible than it had been in the decades before. This context matters for understanding what the show was doing. The yellow-skinned family on Evergreen Terrace was not a generic family. It was a specific response to a specific moment in American economic and cultural life. Homer Simpson was a portrait of a class position under pressure, Springfield was a portrait of a community whose industrial basis was being systematically undermined. The comedy was built on anxiety that was real and specific, and tied to historical conditions that the show's creators understood. As the show ran longer, the historical conditions it was responding to changed. The 1990s and 2000s transformed the American economic landscape in ways that made Homer's specific situation both more and less relevant in different ways. The pressures on working-class American life intensified in some respects. Wages stagnated further, economic mobility declined. The security that the post-war period had offered working-class families became less available. In other respects, the specific flavor of the anxiety changed. New industries, new forms of work, new configurations of American class life produced new anxieties alongside the old ones. The show's response to these changing conditions was to float above them. The floating timeline, which prevented the show from being anchored to any specific historical moment, also prevented it from engaging with the specific historical conditions of any particular period. Springfield could be of any era because it was of no era in particular. The nuclear plant kept running. Homer kept his job. The economy remained vague enough to accommodate any story the writers needed to tell. This detachment from historical specificity has costs and benefits. The benefit is the universality the show's creators always intended a Springfield that could be anywhere, a family that could be any family, an America that could be any America. The cost is that the show, which was originally a specific and grounded response to a specific and grounded historical moment, became progressively less specific and less grounded as it ran longer. The anxiety at the center of the original show, the real, historically specific anxiety of a working-class family navigating an economy that was gradually withdrawing the floor from under them, was softened into a more generic version of domestic comedy anxiety that was less true to anything real. The show looks, from outside, like a monument, one of the most culturally significant artifacts of American television history. 800 episodes, 36 years. The longest-running scripted primetime show in American history. A cast of characters so deeply embedded in American cultural consciousness that they function as reference points for people who have never watched a single episode in full. That monument is real. The show earned it. The first 8 or 10 years of The Simpsons are a genuine and irreplaceable achievement in American comedy and American cultural life. The specific combination of emotional honesty and formal intelligence and satirical precision and genuine warmth that the best episodes achieved is not something that happens often, and it happened here, in a primetime animated show, week after week, for long enough to establish a body of work that stands. The monument is also a sarcophagus. It contains something that is no longer alive in the form it once was. The show continues, and it is technically continuous with the show that produced the best work, and it has the same characters and the same setting and the same format, and it is made by talented people who understand the show's history and are trying to do something worthwhile with it. But the specific quality that made the early show extraordinary, the feeling of being watched by people who understood exactly what they were looking at and were committed to looking at it honestly, that quality is gone, or so diminished that it produces only rare glimpses of itself in isolated moments, rather than the sustained experience that the early seasons delivered. This is not unusual. This is the normal trajectory of creative work that survives its own peak. The monument forms around the achievement, and the achievement becomes increasingly enclosed by the monument, and eventually it is harder to see the work inside the monument than the monument itself. The Simpsons monument is very large, built over 36 years of continuous production, and the original work is inside it, intact, visible in the archive, available to anyone who wants to find it, but you have to know where to look. You have to know that the show was different in its first decade than in its subsequent decades, not just quantitatively different, not just better, but qualitatively different, different in kind, operating from a different kind of understanding of what it was for and what it was trying to do. The show you have been falling asleep to tonight, the version that plays in the background, that provides the familiar warmth and the known rhythms and the voices that have been part of American culture for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. That show is real, and it is valuable, and it is a genuine comfort, but it is the monument version, the archive version, the shape of a thing that was once more alive than it is now. The thing that was more alive is still available. It is in the early seasons. It is in the specific episodes where the show was doing something harder and more honest and more willing to follow its own implications to uncomfortable conclusions. It is in the Homer who looked at Marge in that specific way that the early show allowed itself, and the later show could not always find. It is in Lisa's first saxophone note, and Bart's specific undefended laugh, and Maggie's enormous silent eyes tracking everything from behind her pacifier. It is still there. The archive holds it. The monument protects it, in the specific way that monuments protect things, by surrounding them completely, by making them enormous, by burying the original thing under the accumulated weight of everything that came after. Springfield is still there. The family is still on the couch. The show knew what it knew. It built a monument over the knowing. The monument is very large and very famous, and will probably last longer than most of the things built in America in the same period. The knowing is still inside it. Section 20. Falling asleep in Springfield. It is very late now, or very early depending on where you are and what time you started watching. The episode that is playing on your screen, whichever one it is, whichever season, whichever iteration of the show's long history you happen to be watching, is doing what the show has always done. The characters are being themselves, in their specific ways, in the yellow light of a town that is always exactly as you left it. The jokes are landing or they are not landing, and the emotional beats are arriving or they are not arriving, and somewhere underneath all of it, the same foundation is running that has always been running. Homer loves Marge, the children are safe, the family is on the couch, the lights are on at 742 Evergreen Terrace. We have spent a long time tonight going through everything that is wrong with this show, and there is genuinely a great deal wrong with it. The continuity is broken. The characters have been simplified. The secondary cast has been reduced from specific people to recognizable types. The floating timeline has revised the family's history into a series of contextual drafts that serve the current episode without honoring the specific emotional truth of the earlier ones. The economy does not add up. The deaths do not accumulate into change. The endings cycle back to beginnings. The guest stars left no traces on Homer's biography. The writer's room chose the reliable laugh over the genuine revelation more and more consistently as the seasons accumulated. All of this is true. We have documented it honestly because the show deserves honest documentation after 36 years of being one of the most watched and most analyzed pieces of American television culture in history. And none of it is the most important thing about the show. The most important thing about The Simpsons is that it found a form imperfect, inconsistent, compromised by its own commercial success and its own structural commitments and its own inability to end for something that is very difficult to find a form for. The experience of being a family, not the idea of family, the philosophical concept or the political talking point. The specific, daily, continuous, exhausting, occasionally transcendent experience of being bound to a set of people by love and history and the specific forms of damage that living closely with anyone produces. Homer loves Marge in a way that is not glamorous and not always wise, and not the product of anything he chose except the specific choice to keep choosing her every day, despite everything, including everything he is. That love is real in the show in the way that real things are real in fiction. You recognize it when you see it because it resembles something true about the world, and when you recognize it, you feel something that is not quite laughter and not quite tears, but something in between that is what art is supposed to produce. The show produced that feeling many times. In its best episodes, it produced it consistently. In its later episodes, it produced it occasionally, in isolated moments that were preserved from the drift by being too true to be simplified away. In every episode, somewhere, there is usually something, a line, a look, a moment that gestures toward that original feeling. That reaches back toward the thing the early show was doing and briefly achieves a version of it. The show is wrong about many things. It is right about the most important one. The family stays together. The love is real. The couch is where you end up, at the end of the day, when everywhere else has been tried and the episode has done what it was going to do and the credits are about to roll. That is enough. After everything else we have discussed tonight, that is genuinely enough. The fish has 3 eyes, the plant is leaking, Burns is in his office, ancient and terrible, sustained by his weekly treatments and his 100 years of systematic management of the specific levers of Springfield's decay. Homer is asleep in his chair at the plant, or asleep at the dinner table, or asleep somewhere he should not be asleep, dreaming of something pleasant while the world does what the world does around him. Lisa is in her room playing her saxophone in the dark, the notes traveling through the walls of a house that is built, among other things, on radiation and denial, and a deal that Grandpa Simpson made with the richest man in town. Bart is somewhere, on his skateboard, figuring out what he can get away with in a world that has been systematically arranged to prevent him from getting away with anything that actually matters. Maggie is watching from wherever Maggie watches from, behind her enormous eyes and her pacifier, tracking everything, saying nothing, waiting, and Marge is in the kitchen, or in the living room, or in whatever room the episode placed her in at the end of the day, patient in the way that she has always been patient, not passively patient, not patient from lack of alternatives, but patient in the specific active way of a person who has decided that the love is worth the difficulty and keeps deciding it every day without drama or announcement. That is the family. That is the show. That is what 36 years of Springfield have been building toward and never quite reaching and never quite abandoning. Rest now. You have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. You have looked at it honestly, and that is a thing worth doing. Even when, especially when the honest looking reveals things that are uncomfortable and things that are broken and things that the show itself has declined to look at directly across its entire remarkable and imperfect. Run. You are allowed to love it anyway. Loving imperfect things honestly is one of the things human beings are best at, and The Simpsons has been practiced for that for 36 years. Springfield will be there tomorrow. The plant will be running. The fish will have its 3 eyes. Homer will be asleep somewhere he should not be asleep. The children will be exactly the age they were. Let that be enough for tonight. It is enough. That is the end of this video. If you found yourself somewhere in Springfield tonight, in the yellow light, in the specific warmth of a family that is wrong in many ways and right in the most important one, then something worked the way it was supposed to. Drop your time and your location in the comments. It is always good to know who else is awake in Springfield. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. There are more towns worth examining honestly. There is more television worth loving imperfectly. Rest well. Springfield will be exactly as you left it. It always is. End of complete script. Section 21. The couch gag and what it tells you about the show's soul. There is a piece of the show that almost nobody analyzes and almost everybody watches. The couch gag. 36 years of opening credit sequences, each one culminating in the family rushing to their living room couch to sit down and watch television together. The couch gag varies, this is the whole point. It is the variable element in an otherwise rigidly fixed sequence. And across the show's run, it has ranged from a single-beat visual joke to elaborate productions lasting several minutes. Guest directed by famous animators and artists and filmmakers who used the format to do something formally interesting with the show's most recognizable visual vocabulary. The couch gag is, in its structure, the show's most honest statement about what it is. The credits are always the same, the music is always the same, the sequence of shots, the school, the nuclear plant, the ride home, the front door is always the same. And then, at the end of the familiar sequence, when the family arrives at the couch, something different happens. The sameness delivers the different. The routine produces the variation. This is the show's formal thesis, enacted every episode before the story even begins. The sameness and the variation are not in tension with each other. They are the same mechanism. You need the sameness to deliver the variation. The familiar sequence has to run its course before the couch gag can land. The variation is only legible as variation against the background of the fixed. Springfield in this reading is the fixed sequence. The contamination, the economy, the institutional capture, the collective amnesia, these are the conditions that run before the story begins. Every episode, without variation. They are the setup for everything else. The couch gag, the specific event of this specific episode, is what happens when the family arrives home within those fixed conditions. The variation that the fixed sequence enables. The couch gag has also, across the show's history, been the space where the show has allowed itself to be most formally adventurous. Directors and animators who brought their own aesthetic vocabularies to the format, the couch gags that become surrealist films or action sequences, or elaborate visual jokes that require knowing the show's history to fully appreciate have produced some of the most genuinely interesting animation the show has ever presented. Not in service of story, not in service of character, in service of the format itself. The specific pleasure of doing something unexpected with the most expected moment in the episode. The couch gag is the show's most explicit acknowledgement that format is not a prison. That the same opening can lead to something different every time. That the fixed structure is generative rather than limiting. That returning to the same place over and over is compatible with arriving somewhere new. This is, in a way, the show's argument against its own critics. The critics who say that The Simpsons has been doing the same thing for too long are not wrong about the facts. The show has been doing the same thing, structurally, for 36 years, but the couch gag is the show's answer. The same structure can produce different things if the imagination inside it is genuinely different. The problem is not the structure. The problem is when the imagination inside the structure stops being genuinely different and starts reproducing the same variations in the same patterns. The couch gag at its best demonstrates what the early show's writing demonstrated, that constraints enable creativity rather than preventing it, that the fixed form is what makes the variation meaningful, that Springfield's specific and established wrongness is what makes the moments of rightness within it legible and precious. The couch gag at its worst, when it is simply a brief visual joke recycled from an idea the show had years ago, demonstrates what the later show's writing demonstrated, that the same structure, operated by imagination that is no longer fully engaged with what the structure can produce, generates content that is recognizable but not alive. The credits roll. The music plays. The sequence runs its course. The family arrives at the couch. Something happens. What happens is the whole show in miniature every episode for 36 years. Section 22. Bart versus the world he was born into. There is a specific quality to Bart Simpson that the show has never fully named but has consistently depicted. He is a person conducting an ongoing experiment in the specific question of what is possible within fixed constraints. The constraints are Springfield, his family, his school, his age. The experiment is everything he does within those constraints. The pranks, the escapes, the improvisations, the specific forms of creative misbehavior that have defined his character since the show's first episode. The experiment is not purely destructive, although it often produces destruction. It is investigative. Bart is asking, over and over, in the only vocabulary available to a 10-year-old boy in Springfield, what is actually possible here? What can actually be done? Where the real limits are, as opposed to the stated limits that adults invoke. Whether the world as described to him is actually the world as it operates. This is a real and valuable cognitive project. It is, in the stripped-down form available to a child, the same project that all genuine inquiry involves: the refusal to accept the map as equivalent to the territory, the insistence on testing the stated rules against actual experience to see which of them hold and which of them are conventions that collapse under pressure. The tragedy of Bart's character, the tragedy the early show understood and the later show progressively abandoned, is that this experimental intelligence never found a legitimate channel. Every institution Bart encountered treated his inquiry as a problem to be managed rather than a capacity to be developed. The school responded to his refusal to accept the stated rules by punishing the refusal rather than engaging with the genuine cognitive energy behind it. His father's primary response to his behavior was strangling. His experience of authority was almost entirely the experience of authority's enforcement rather than authority's mentorship. A child conducting the experiment that Bart is conducting needs, at some point, an adult who can see what the experiment is actually about and redirect it towards something that builds rather than destroys. The show provided this, briefly, in specific episodes: the teacher who recognized something in him, the adult who saw his capability and named it, and then withdrew it, as it withdraws everything, and Bart returned to baseline. What the show never provided, across 36 years of episodes, was a sustained adult presence in Bart's life, who understood him well enough to stay. Every mentor figure was temporary. Every recognition was episodic. The experiment continued without a collaborator, directed entirely by Bart's own undirected energy, producing results that were alternately brilliant and catastrophic and always forgotten by the next episode. The specific intelligence that Bart has, the social intelligence, the improvisational capability, the ability to read situations and people with a speed and accuracy that formal education does not develop and cannot measure, is the intelligence of someone who grew up in an environment that required quick, practical thinking to navigate. Springfield, with its compressed geography of dysfunction, produced exactly the kind of person it would need to navigate Springfield. He is perfectly adapted to his environment. He is entirely unsuited to any other one. This is what the flash-forward episodes show when they depict adult Bart, a person whose specific capabilities are deeply calibrated to a world that does not exist outside Springfield, who struggles outside the specific constraints that his intelligence was developed to work within. The early show understood this as tragedy. Bart has exactly the right capabilities for exactly the wrong world. Changing the world would require resources and institutional change that are not available. Changing Bart would require the kind of sustained developmental support that Springfield does not provide. The gap between what he has and what he would need to use it well remains open, episode after episode, year after year. The later show understood this primarily as a comedy premise. Bart is the troublemaker. He gets in trouble. He escapes trouble. The trouble repeats. The cycle is the show. The deeper tragedy of a child whose specific capabilities never found adequate expression that remained present in the later show as a ghost of the earlier characterization, visible occasionally in isolated moments, but no longer the sustained subject of the show's attention. He skates down the street, helmetless, grinning, the Springfield skyline behind him and the cooling towers on the horizon. He is exactly 10 years old. He has always been exactly 10 years old. He will be exactly 10 years old until the show stops running. The experiment continues. The constraints remain exactly what they are. The world he was born into will never be different from what it is. And Bart keeps asking what is possible within it, because asking is what he knows how to do, because asking is the only thing Springfield has never managed to train out of him despite everything it has tried. Section 23. The Simpsons as a document of American anxiety. Every great television show is, among other things, a document, not always intentionally. Not always in ways its creators fully understood at the time, but the shows that endure, that generate the kind of sustained cultural attention that The Simpsons has generated for 3.5 decades, endure partly because they captured something real about the specific anxieties and the specific conditions and the specific quality of the moment in which they were made. The Simpsons is one of the most complete documents of American anxiety in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st that exists in any medium, not because it set out to be a historical document, because it was paying attention, in its best years, to the real texture of American life in a way that produced an accumulation of observed truth that constitutes a record even if no record was being intentionally made. The specific anxieties the show documented are not subtle. They are the anxieties that anyone paying attention to American life in the 1990s would have recognized. The anxiety about whether the specific working-class life that Homer Simpson represents was still viable, economically and culturally. The anxiety about environmental damage and corporate indifference to it. The anxiety about the specific ways that American institutions, educational, political, medical, regulatory, were failing the people they nominally existed to serve. The anxiety about the specific forms of damage that American masculinity, in the form that Homer Simpson represented it, did to the people living with the men who embodied it. These anxieties are present in the show explicitly and implicitly, in storylines that address them directly and in background details that encode them into the visual and narrative texture of Springfield. They are present in the yellow skin and the three-eyed fish, and the 1400 safety violations, and Homer's specific cognitive profile, and Burns's specific immunity from consequences. They are the water the show swims in, and like all water, they are invisible to the creatures that live in them and visible only from the outside. The show also documented something that it was perhaps less consciously aware of: the specific cultural moment in which American popular entertainment began to accommodate the complexity of working-class life in ways that earlier decades had not. The Simpsons arrived at the moment when the cultural mainstream was beginning to engage with the specific texture of working-class American experience, not as a pathology to be explained or a virtue to be celebrated, but as a lived reality with its own specific pleasures and difficulties and forms of meaning. Homer Simpson is, in this context, a culturally significant figure beyond his role as a comedy character. He is one of the first characters in American mainstream entertainment to be depicted as genuinely representative of his class, not as a caricature, not as a poor white trash joke, not as a noble struggling everyman, but as a specific human being whose class position shapes his psychology and his limitations and his specific forms of love and failure in ways that are honest rather than idealized or demeaned. The early show treated Homer's class position with the seriousness it deserved, not solemnly, but honestly. His financial anxiety was real. His relationship with his employer was the relationship of someone who has no meaningful economic power relative to the entity that controls his income. His specific cognitive profile, reduced by environmental exposure, by childhood brain damage, by the accumulated effects of an environment that did not develop, what he had was a portrait of what real cognitive limitation looks like in a real person. Not a cartoon exaggeration of stupidity, but a specific and traceable pattern of capability and incapacity. The show documented this. It put it on screen, week after week, for 36 years. Not always with the same care as the early seasons, the care diminished as the show ran longer, and the documentation became progressively less specific and more generic. But the record exists. The archive holds it. The specific anxieties of the late 1980s and 1990s that the show documented are not all historical curiosities. Some of them have intensified. The economic conditions that made Homer Simpson's life financially precarious in the show's early seasons have, in many respects, become more difficult for the households Homer Simpson represents. The contamination of working-class communities by industrial practices and institutional indifference to environmental harm, the very thing the yellow skin and the three-eyed fish were documenting, has continued and, in some cases, worsened. The institutional capture that Burns represents, the systematic use of concentrated economic power to shape political and regulatory outcomes, has become a more visible feature of American political life, rather than a less visible one. Springfield was a document. The document describes a condition that has not been resolved. The town that the show built in its early seasons is more recognizable as a real place today than it was in 1989, not because the show was prophetic, but because the conditions it was documenting were structural and have continued to produce the same patterns. This is a strange and slightly uncomfortable thing to sit with. The show that was supposed to be satire, the exaggerated, heightened cartoon version of American life, turns out to have been more documentary than most of its viewers understood at the time. Springfield is a real place, not geographically, but in every sense that matters for understanding what American communities look like when a single industrial interest has enough economic power to shape them, when the regulatory infrastructure is insufficient or compromised, when the collective capacity for clear seeing has been systematically undermined by the same forces that profit from the not seeing. The fish has three eyes. The show told you. You laughed. It told you again, and again, and again. It is still telling you. In every episode, in the yellow skin and the cracked towers, and Homer asleep in his chair and Burns in his office, calculating the next arrangement that extends his position, it is still telling you. It has been telling you since the 17th of December, 1989. The question the show asks, silently, in every frame, is whether you are ready to hear it. Springfield is right here. It has always been right here. You have been watching it your whole life. Final section. Turning the light off in Springfield. The last thing to do, before sleep takes over completely and Springfield recedes into the background hum it has always been best at maintaining, is to say the simplest, true thing about all of this. About the show, about the town, about 36 years and 800 episodes and all the ways it was wrong, and all the ways it was right, and all the ways it was both simultaneously, as the best things usually are. The Simpsons is a love story. Not a romance, though romance is in it. A love story in the broader and more serious sense. A story about the specific, difficult, imperfect, daily, ongoing act of choosing to love the people who are yours. Not because they are easy to love, not because they deserve it unconditionally in every moment, but because they are yours and you are theirs, and the specific bond that creates is one of the few things in human life that holds when everything else is in the process of not holding. Homer loves Marge. This is the fixed point around which everything else orbits. It has been the fixed point since the first episode, and it has not changed in 36 years through every revision and every drift and every mistake and every simplified version of every character and every celebrity episode and every floating timeline revision. The love is the thing that does not float. Everything else floats. The love stays, and the love is not simple. The early show understood this and honored it. Homer's love for Marge is real, and it is also, in the specific ways that real love is complicated, insufficient. It is real, and it is accompanied by his genuine inability to see her clearly much of the time, by his obliviousness to the specific weight of what she carries, by his tendency to sleep through the most important moments. The love coexists with all of that. It is not diminished by it. It is what it is in spite of all of it, and what it is the thing that keeps the family together, and the lights on, and the couch occupied every episode, without exception. The show has been building towards something for 36 years that it will probably never fully articulate. The thing it has been building toward is the acknowledgement that love, in its ordinary, everyday, imperfect form, is not the lesser thing. That the specific love that exists between two people in a yellow house in a contaminated town at the end of a long day, when Homer is tired and Marge is patient and the children are somewhere in the house and the television is on, that this love, this particular ordinary imperfect love, is as much as any human being has any right to expect from a life. The show knows this. It demonstrates it in every episode. It would not say it so directly, because saying it directly would make it easy to dismiss. Instead, it shows it through the family on the couch and the couch gag that varies and the love that does not vary and the yellow light of the house that is always on, always exactly as you left it, always waiting for the family to come home. That is the show. That is the whole show. Everything else. The continuity errors and the simplified characters and the celebrity guests and the floating timeline and the graveyard full of things the show said and then forgot. Everything else is the context in which the love exists. The imperfect, compromised, contaminated context. Springfield. Springfield is the context for the love. That is why Springfield is wrong in all the ways it is wrong. Because love requires an imperfect context. Love in a perfect context is not love. It is something easier and less real. Love in Springfield, love in the yellow contaminated company town cycling amnesiac Springfield is the real thing. The difficult thing? The thing that stays when everything else resets. Go to sleep now. The show is still playing somewhere. The family is on the couch. Homer is probably asleep somewhere he should not be asleep, dreaming something pleasant, unaware of whatever is happening around him that he will miss and not know he missed. Marge is patient. The children are at their fixed ages, preserved in the specific moments before their specific futures become inevitable. The lights are on at 742 Evergreen Terrace. They are always on. That is the show's final statement, made in every episode, in the specific warm yellow of a house that is someone's home. The lights are on, the family is home, rest well. End of complete script to 40,000 words. Bonus section. The specific sounds of Springfield and everything the audio tells you that the picture doesn't. There is an element of The Simpsons that almost never gets discussed in analytical conversations about the show, and that is the sound design. Not the music. The Danny Elfman theme is discussed extensively and deservedly, and the show's incidental music and the specific musical cues associated with specific characters and situations are reasonably well documented by fans and critics. The sound design in the deeper sense, the specific ambient quality of Springfield as an acoustic environment, the voices and their evolution, the specific way certain sounds became inseparable from certain feelings about the show. The voices are the most obvious place to start. The core cast voices Dan Castellaneta as Homer, Julie Kavner as Marge, Nancy Cartwright as Bart, Yeardley Smith as Lisa, and the remarkable Hank Azaria and Harry Shearer, handling the enormous range of secondary Springfield characters between them, are as recognizable as any sounds in American popular culture. You could identify Homer's voice from 3 syllables in a noisy room. You could identify Marge's from a single anxious sound she makes when something is going wrong. What is interesting about the voice performances is how the specific actors' approaches to their characters encoded information about those characters that the writing did not always explicitly provide. Dan Castellaneta's Homer in the early seasons, has a specific quality of vulnerability underneath the buffoonery, a quality in his voice when Homer is uncertain or frightened or suddenly overcome by feeling that communicates the interior person underneath the exterior comedy. The voice does work that the script cannot always do. It makes Homer's emotional life legible in moments where the dialogue is not directly addressing it. As the show ran longer and the vocal performances necessarily settled into the established patterns, the actors knowing their characters so completely that the performances became, in a certain sense, automatic. Something of that early quality of discovery was lost. Not entirely. The best later vocal performances from Castellaneta still achieve the specific vulnerability, but less consistently, and the difference is audible if you listen carefully to early and late Homer side by side. Julie Kavner's Marge is one of the most physically distinctive performances in television history. The voice is the product of a specific physical configuration of Kavner's vocal apparatus that produces its particular raspy quality, and that is, in the strictest physiological sense, unreplicable by anyone else. What Kavner does with that voice across 3 decades of Marge is a sustained performance achievement that gets almost no attention because it exists in an animated context where the voice is not attached to a visible physical body, therefore does not register in the way that a live-action performance would. The specific quality of Kavner's Marge in the emotional scenes, the way the rasp in the voice becomes something different when Marge is genuinely distressed, the specific register she finds when Marge is trying to hold something together that is in the process of falling apart, the particular sound of Marge at her most patient and at her most exhausted, which are often the same moment, is a performance that rewards close listening in ways that casual viewing cannot fully appreciate. Yeardley Smith's Lisa is, from a pure vocal performance standpoint, one of the most technically demanding performances in the show. The character requires a specific combination of a child's register and a sophisticated adult intelligence behind it. The voice must sound young, and the delivery must communicate an intellectual and emotional complexity that goes well beyond what the voice's apparent age would suggest. Smith manages this across thousands of lines of dialogue across 36 years with a consistency that is genuinely remarkable. The sound of Springfield itself, the ambient hum of the plant in the background of outdoor scenes, the specific acoustic quality of Moe's Tavern, the way the school sounds different from the home, which sounds different from Burns's office, is part of the show's world building that is easy to take for granted because it is always present, and therefore nearly invisible. The show built a sonic environment that is consistent and specific, and that contributes to the sense of Springfield as a real place, rather than a backdrop, in ways that are felt rather than noticed. The specific sound of the plant deserves its own moment. In episodes set at the nuclear facility, there is a low-frequency industrial hum that runs under the dialogue and the ambient room noise, a sound that connotes industrial process, contained power, the specific quality of a place where enormous forces are being managed in ways that are, at any moment, potentially not quite adequate to the forces being managed. This sound is never commented on by the characters. It is simply there, but it contributes to the specific feeling of the plant as a setting. Not scary in an obvious way, but subtly wrong, subtly too much. The sound of something running at the edge of what it should be allowed to run at. This is the show's most intimate engagement with the radiation theory that runs through its visual vocabulary. The plant sounds like what it is. A facility operating slightly beyond what safety requires, filled with a power that is the source of the town's light and the source of the town's damage simultaneously. You have been hearing this sound for every episode set at the plant, across 36 years. You probably have not consciously noticed it, but your body registered it. The low-frequency industrial hum is the sound of Springfield's secret, delivered directly to your nervous system every episode, below the threshold of conscious analysis. The show has always been more honest about what it knows than its surface suggests. The sounds are one more way that honesty has been encoded into the work, available to anyone paying close enough attention, consistent across the show's run, even when other elements of the show's consistency have drifted. Listen for it. Next time the episode plays and Homer is in the plant, and the dialogue is running and the jokes are landing, listen for the hum underneath all of it. The hum that has been running since the beginning. The sound of the machine that powers everything. The sound of the thing that the show has been telling you about in every available medium for 36 years. It is the sound of Springfield. It is the sound of everything wrong with Springfield. And it is a sound so familiar that most people have stopped hearing it, which is, in the end, exactly how Springfield works. Bonus Section 2. The show that taught you what television could be, then showed you what it usually is. There is a specific experience that long-term viewers of The Simpsons have had at various points across the show's run, and it is worth naming because it is one of the show's most significant, unintentional contributions to television literacy. The experience is this. You watch an early season episode, one of the ones from the show's peak years, and you feel, while watching it, the specific quality of excellence that makes it what it is. The density of the comedy, the emotional precision, the specific feeling of watching people who understand their characters deeply generating behavior that is surprising and inevitable simultaneously. You feel this. You register it. And then you watch a later episode from the show's middle or later seasons, and the absence of that specific quality is perceptible in a way it would not be perceptible if you had not just experienced its presence. The later episode is not terrible. It is probably competently made, reliably funny in its way, recognizably The Simpsons. But the specific quality that the early episode had is not present. You can feel its absence as a specific negative space in the experience of watching. The early show taught you what to feel when television is being done at the highest level in its genre. And then the later show gave you the experience of watching the same show without that quality, which is the experience of understanding what the quality was by experiencing what it looks like when it is gone. This is, in an odd way, one of the show's most valuable contributions to its audience. Most television viewers develop their sense of quality gradually, through the accumulated experience of watching many different shows at many different levels of quality, building a comparative framework over years of viewing. The Simpsons compressed this process into a single show. You could develop a sophisticated sense of what excellent television comedy feels like, and what good but not excellent television comedy feels like by watching the same characters in the same setting across different seasons. The comparison was built in. This comparison is part of why the discourse about The Simpsons' decline is so persistent and so specific. People do not discuss the decline of most long-running shows with the same precision and the same emotional investment. Most long-running shows decline, and the decline is noted and people stop watching. The Simpsons' decline generates active, ongoing, detailed discussion because the show itself gave its audience the tools to understand what the decline is and why it matters. The early show built a set of standards that the later show is measured against. The measuring is painful in proportion to how high the early show set the standards. This is also why the show is still worth watching, in some form, even in its diminished later incarnations. Not because the later seasons are as good as the early ones, they are not. But because the whole show, early and later and everything in between, is a resource for understanding something about quality and popular art that is difficult to acquire any other way. It is one of the few places in American popular culture where you can watch something go from extraordinary to ordinary and understand in real time and in specific detail what was lost and when it was lost and what replacing it with looked like. That is worth something. It is a kind of education that the show provides without intending to, as a byproduct of its longevity and the accessibility of its archive. The whole thing is available. The early and the late, the extraordinary and the ordinary, all of it at your fingertips anytime you want it, any hour of the night. Tonight you have been falling asleep to the ordinary version. The version that plays in the background, that provides the specific warmth of familiar rhythms and known voices. That is the version that sleep benefits from, not the episodes that demand your full attention and reward it with genuine revelation, but the ones that are comfortable enough to serve as company without requiring your engagement. Both versions are the show. Both are Springfield. The extraordinary version and the comfortable ordinary version are the same town, the same family, the same yellow light. One version is what the show was at its best. The other version is what it became when it ran long enough to become what most things become. A comfortable, recognizable, warm, slightly diminished version of what it was at the height of its powers. You are falling asleep in the comfortable version. The extraordinary version is available whenever you want it. The archive is there. The early seasons are exactly where you left them. Springfield will be exactly as you left it. The lights are on. Rest now. Complete full script. Bonus section 3. The things the show got right that nobody talks about. We have spent most of this video cataloging the show's failures, and the failures are real and worth cataloging. But fairness requires spending some time on the things the show got right that rarely come up in the discourse about what the show got wrong. The specific achievements that persist even in the show's declining years, the things that the show has managed to do consistently across its entire run that represent genuine and underappreciated craft. The show has always been technically remarkable at physical comedy. Not the slapstick of Homer taking a fall, though that is also present and consistently well executed. The specific physical comedy of the show's best moments is something subtler. The way the animation conveys character through body language, the specific physical vocabulary of each character that tells you who they are before any dialogue begins. Homer's specific posture, that particular slump, that specific way of occupying a space as if he has always been in it and expects to remain there indefinitely, communicates his entire psychology in a single frame. Marge's hands, the way she holds herself when she is containing anxiety, the specific movement pattern of her body when she is trying to manage a situation that is threatening to become unmanageable, are a performance that Kavner's voice and the animator's choices create together in ways that neither could achieve alone. The show has also been consistently good at the specific comedy of failed communication, the moments where two characters are trying to express something to each other, and the gap between what each means and what the other receives, produces comedy that is also, underneath the comedy, a genuine observation about how human communication actually works. Homer trying to tell Marge something important through the specific vocabulary of gestures and half-sentences that is his natural language, and Marge trying to receive it through the specific vocabulary of anxious interpretation that is hers, and the two of them arriving at an adjacent understanding that is slightly wrong in ways that are both funny and true. The show has done this many times, and it has done it well every time. The show has also been consistently accurate about the specific dynamics of sibling relationships. Bart and Lisa's specific dynamic, the combination of genuine affection and genuine contempt, the specific ways they understand each other better than anyone else in their world does while also being specifically calibrated to get under each other's skin, is one of the most accurately observed sibling relationships in American television. They are recognizably a specific pair of siblings rather than a generic illustration of sibling rivalry. The early show understood the specific quality of this relationship and rendered it with precision. The show has also, in its best moments across its entire run, including its declining years, maintained something genuine in its depiction of fatherhood. Not the idealized version, not the comedic buffoon version, but the specific complicated version. A father who loves his children completely and understands them imperfectly, and is trying in the specific way of someone who did not have good models for what trying looks like. Homer's fatherhood is a sustained portrait of good intentions imperfectly executed, and the show has always known the difference between the imperfect execution and the absence of genuine intention. There is an episode, and there are several, like it scattered across even the later seasons, where Homer does something for one of his children that costs him something real. Not a grand sacrifice, not a dramatic gesture, but something quiet and specific and genuinely costly to him, done because he loves them and because in the specific moment, he is capable of acting from love rather than from habit or avoidance. These moments are in the show across its entire run. They are less frequent in the later seasons, but they are there, and they always land with the specific weight of something true. That is the thing the show keeps getting right, even when it is getting other things wrong. The weight of genuine love expressed imperfectly by imperfect people in an imperfect place. The weight does not diminish as the seasons accumulate. The specific gravity of Homer's genuine love for his family pulls every episode back towards something real, even when everything else in the episode is drifting. It is the show's anchor. It has always been the show's anchor. Everything else resets. The love does not reset. It is the one fixed point in Springfield's cycling universe, and it has kept the show in orbit around something worth watching for 36 years. That is the highest compliment you can pay to a piece of sustained creative work. It kept its anchor. Through all the drift and all the decline and all the accumulated weight of too many episodes and too much time, the thing that mattered most stayed exactly where it needed to be. Homer loves Marge. The family is on the couch. The lights are on. Everything else in this video is footnotes to that sentence. Sleep well, wherever you are. The show is still playing somewhere. It will be playing long after this video ends, long after you wake up, long after the specific episode you were watching when sleep finally arrived has finished and rolled into the next one. Springfield cycles. The family returns to baseline. The love persists. That is the whole story. Good night. End. Bonus section 4. Everything that runs underneath a final meditation. This is the section that happens after you have stopped taking notes, after the analytical framework has been assembled and the evidence has been cataloged and the patterns have been named. The section that exists in the space between the last thing said and the first moment of actual sleep. The Simpsons is, among other things, a meditation on the specific forms of American forgetting. Not simply political forgetting the town's failure to acknowledge its environmental contamination or its institutional capture, but personal forgetting. The forgetting that happens within a marriage when the daily accumulation of life together buries the specific qualities that made the other person arresting in the first place. The forgetting that happens within a family when the habits of living together replace the active perception of who each family member actually is. The forgetting that happens within a self when the years accumulate and the original clarity of one's own desires and fears becomes less available than it was. Homer has forgotten more about himself and about Marge and about his children than he ever knew. The forgetting is part of who he is. It is written into his specific cognitive profile, the result of every injury and every exposure and every developmental gap that produced him. But it is also the ordinary forgetting of an ordinary life, lived at the pace that ordinary life demands. He is too busy surviving to attend to the full texture of what he is surviving for. This is not unique to Homer. This is recognizable. The show catches the moments when the forgetting is briefly suspended. The moments when Homer, despite everything, sees Marge clearly sees the specific person she is, the specific choice she has represented and continues to represent, the specific nature of what it means that she is still there. These moments are in the show across its entire run, and they are always the show at its truest because they are the moments when Homer's specific limitations are temporarily not operating and the love underneath them is visible without mediation. You have probably had a version of this experience in your own life. The moment when you see someone you love clearly, as if for the first time, after a period of habitual not seeing. The moment when the person you have been taking for granted, not maliciously, not deliberately, but in the ordinary way of people who share space and time and responsibility, and eventually stop fully seeing each other through sheer familiarity, comes back into focus, and you feel, for the specific duration of the clear seeing, the full weight of what that person is to you and what it would mean to lose them. The Simpsons has been depicting this moment, in variations, for 36 years. Depicting it and then resetting it because the clear seeing does not last, in Homer or in anyone, because the demands of daily life reassert themselves and the habitual not seeing resumes. But the moment is there. It keeps coming back. It is the thing the show preserves across all of its other failures, and all of its other drifts, and all of the ways it has simplified and compromised and continued past its own best self. The moment of clear seeing. The weight of love perceived directly rather than through the fog of familiarity. The specific quality of what it feels like to be grateful, actually grateful, for the person who is there. That is what the show has always been trying to say. That is the sentence underneath every other sentence, running through every episode from the first to the most recent, making itself available in every episode that has ever made you feel something you did not expect to feel when you sat down to watch a cartoon. You are allowed to fall asleep now. The sentence will still be running when you wake up. Springfield will be exactly as you left it. The family will be on the couch. The lights at 742 Evergreen Terrace are on. They have always been on. They are on right now. Good night, Springfield. Good night, Homer. Good night, Marge. Good night, Bart. Wherever you are on that skateboard, wherever the night has taken you. Good night, Lisa, still playing in the dark. Good night, Maggie, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting. Good night. End of complete script. Bonus section 5. The sound of the closing credits and what you carry out of Springfield. There is something that happens at the end of a Simpsons episode, in the specific seconds between the final scene and the closing credits, that has always operated slightly outside the show's normal comic register. The closing music, the Danny Elfman theme rephrased into a slower, more spacious arrangement, does something to the tone of the ending that the episode itself does not always earn. It makes the ending feel more significant than it usually is. More conclusive. More like something that has actually resolved rather than simply stopped. This is probably intentional, and it is one of the more honest formal choices the show makes. The music acknowledges, at the end of every episode, that more has happened here than the comedy fully captured. That the family on the couch, resolved back to their baseline configuration, carries more weight than any individual episode's plot has managed to fully express. The music is doing the work that the episode couldn't. It is providing the emotional conclusion that the episodic reset structurally prevents the story from providing. The closing credits roll. The names of the people who made this episode appear. The show moves on. Springfield resets. And you carry out of the episode whatever it gave you: the laugh, the moment that landed differently than expected, the rare flash of something true that broke through the familiar rhythms, along with the weight of the music that acknowledged, at the end, that Springfield contains more than any single episode can hold. This is worth naming because it is the show's most regular and most underappreciated act of honesty. The closing music is the show saying, "We know. We know that what you just watched was less than what is possible here. We know that the characters are more than any single episode was able to fully use. We know that the family, sitting together at the end of yet another cycling episode, deserves more gravity than the comedy was able to give them. The music gives them the gravity. 30 seconds of orchestral weight that the episode did not earn, but that 36 years of accumulated love for these characters earns retroactively, lending to the most ordinary episode a brief sense that something significant occurred here, in this yellow house, in this impossible town, on this couch. And then the credits end, and the next episode begins, or the screen goes dark, or you fall asleep with the music still fading. Springfield was always the destination. You are here, you arrived. Whatever else is wrong with the town, and we have cataloged it at length, and the catalog is accurate, you arrived at a place that has been on for 36 years and has kept the lights on this whole time. That is not nothing. In a world where most things end quickly and most lights go out, a light that has been on for 36 years is something to notice. Notice it. Let it be enough for tonight. Let the music finish. Let the credits roll. Let Springfield be exactly what it is, wrong in all the ways we discussed, and right in the most important one, the one that runs underneath all the wrongness and keeps the whole thing worth returning to. The family is on the couch, the lights are on. Good night. There is a quiet that settles over Springfield after the credits run. You do not hear it in the episodes. You feel it in the pause between the last frame and whatever comes next in your evening. The specific quality of a world that exists in the specific time zone of the television, always just slightly removed from real time, always lit with a warmth slightly too consistent to be daylight, always populated by people whose problems are real enough to generate genuine feeling but contained enough to resolve before the hour is up. That quiet is where all of this has been heading. Not the analysis, not the catalog of errors, not even the love story that runs underneath everything. The quiet, the specific piece of a place that has been consistent for 36 years, that will be there when you come back to it, that holds all of its wrongness and all of its rightness in the same warm yellow frame and asks nothing of you except to watch, or to fall asleep watching, or to let it run in the background of whatever your evening has become. You have done enough tonight. The analysis is complete. The catalog is full. Everything wrong with The Simpsons has been named, examined, held up to the light, and found to be wrong in the ways it is wrong and right in the ways it is right. Springfield is still there. The family is still on the couch. The lights at 742 Evergreen Terrace are still on. They will be on tomorrow. They have always been on. Good night from Springfield. Sleep well. The show will be exactly as you left it when you come back. It always is. The town that the show built is imperfect in the specific ways we have spent hours cataloging. It is also, underneath all of those imperfections, the most consistent act of love that American primetime television has ever committed to. 36 years of the same family, the same house, the same yellow light, that is extraordinary. Whatever else is wrong with Springfield, That specific fact is not wrong. That specific fact is as right as anything gets. And that is enough. It has